thank you everyone for joining today for the 10th anniversary of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. I'm absolutely delighted to celebrate. Thank you. So my name is Leah Gerber. About 10 years ago, with many of you, a group of faculty, graduate students, scholars from around campus, we noticed the disconnect between the scholarship that we're producing and the real world needs that are out there that practitioners are employing to address the biodiversity crisis. And it's been quite an amazing journey to work with folks from across disciplines, across campus, to really rethink how we're approaching this problem in an innovative way. And not only do the scholarship, but also establish partnerships with outside entities from the corporate, NGO, and government sector. So across sectors, and work in a collaborative way to continually identify a problem, do research, collaborate to determine, is the research still relevant, to avoid the problem of going down a pathway where we're solving a problem that is no longer relevant. So I have learned a ton. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to lead this effort with so many brilliant scholars, and also to have created such a wonderful, supportive, intellectual community. And so thank you. So today, what are the goals? What do we want to do today in this amazing room? Well, we have an amazing panel, a set of panels, as you will see if you haven't seen. The goals for today are to celebrate our success and to engage you all in setting the path for the future, the next 10 years, in a inclusive way. Some of you were involved in the early inception of CBO and remember those early town hall events that defined the work that we've done over the last decade. So we want this to be an inclusive process, and you will see throughout the room there are these boards where you could post ideas with sticky notes that we'll be distributing momentarily. And also, I think this is really important, especially because we're part of the Global Futures Lab, and there's so much going on in the space of sustainability, yet we often work in silos. So I'm really excited to find synergies from different units, centers, entities across campus to better achieve sustainability writ large. So let me remind you of why we set up the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes and what we're all about. So some of you may remember in 2019, a few years ago, this headline got a lot of attention. 1 million species face extinction in the next decade. This is alarming, and the world is sending fire alarms about this headline. What do? Well, the traditional approach is we bury our heads in the sand and we do research and we publish papers and we hope someone picks it up and it makes their way to decision making. That's not what we're doing here. We're trying to bring together different ideas. How do we address this? Realizing that the traditional approach to addressing conservation has not worked. So we came up with a vision and a mission, which is articulated here, and I'm excited to continue and expand the breadth of this mission and vision over the next decade. So as I said, why? Why biodiversity? There are so many issues. There's water, energy, all of these sustainability challenges, let alone other domains, other huge, significant social problems. So why biodiversity? Why? Well, we need biodiversity to survive and thrive. And weirdly, biodiversity is completely marginalized in policy making and decision making. So why is there this disconnect? I don't understand. How is it that human civilization has not addressed this crisis? That's what our work is. And I'm looking at Shirley Ann because I don't know if she knew we had a picture of her. So how we do this is we do research that is specifically driven by the needs and knowledge needs and problem statements of decision makers. So we're not inventing the problem. We're asking the decision makers and our partners, what is the problem? Let's work together. Sometimes even just defining the problem is a challenge. So, and it changes over time. So that's where our spirit of co-production is a key element of how we operate. And we do that through partnerships, and you'll hear about a couple of partnerships with companies. Who would have thought that we'd be working with the corporate sector? But it turns out working with the corporate sector is an important mechanism to achieve impact. Also you'll hear about some of the examples of our partnership, for example, with Conservation International, also with US Fish and Wildlife Service, to bring science into the decision-making process in a way to improve our collective goals of addressing the extinction crisis. And of course, because we're at a university, we are doing this in a way where we're training the next generation. So you'll see today, we don't have a panel of grad students. Grad students are leading the research. They're on every panel. And I'm delighted, and I couldn't be more proud of the work that these grad students are doing. And they are the ones that are going to be leading the next decades in, quote, saving the planet. So today's discussion centers around our 3 strategic pillar areas. And many of you who have been associated with CBO have seen this figure and stared at it more than you want to, but I'll quickly walk you through it. So what we do is we aim to center biodiversity in the world's decision-making, and that is aligned specifically with this idea of how is it that we have this crisis, but there's a disconnect in the policy and decision-making space. Let's bridge that gap by taking this iterative process where we bring data to decisions in a co-production process that leads to outcomes. So, because no one has ever done this, we are studying the process. Some of us in this room have a National Science Foundation grant to study how does this work. So we're pioneering this type of science as well, and that is this green circle. We're establishing a model for how we do this. How do we create this boundary organization that links science to decision-making and studies that process? So if we want to scale this effort and other entities around the world want to employ such a model, they can learn and or build on our work. And then finally, as I mentioned, training the next generation. So by embedding students and postdocs and early career scientists in this work, we are empowering the next generation to lead in the future. So at this point, I'd like to share a celebratory video, and then I will be introducing the panels. So please join me in enjoying this celebratory video.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to congratulate the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes to its 10th anniversary. Over the past decade, CBO has reminded us of the importance of biodiversity and the services that we get from the biosystem, sometimes called ecosystem services. And as we are moving forward in the future, we know that all the systems and its biodiversity are under increasing stress from human activities. Some scientists actually say we might move towards the 6th mass extinction. And we have to keep in mind that the first 5 were caused by natural causes, but this one would be caused actually by human activities. The mission of the Global Futures Laboratory is to understand the world in which we live, to see which pressures we have put upon it, and most importantly, to envision how we can take some of these pressures off the life-supporting systems and how we can get back into equilibrium with the natural systems. In this context, it is important to understand how we can deal better with the natural ecosystems, with their biodiversity, and how we can protect these areas, such as through the establishment of marine protected areas. And CBO was early in the game in thinking about what outcomes do we need in order to keep the biodiversity loss at bay and to ensure that our biosystems will be available to us and future generations. With that in mind, I'm looking forward to another 10, 20, 30 years of successful work of CBO. And I also would like to congratulate Leah, who with a lot of foresight created CBO 10 years ago. And I'm looking forward to working with her on keeping CBO at the forefront of this ever more important field for many years to come.
Hi, I'm Kendrick Sumi, and I'm Dean of Natural Sciences in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and professor in the School of Life Sciences. On behalf of the college, I'd like to congratulate the CBO on 10 successful years of translating biodiversity science into societal outcomes. And I look forward to watching the future successes of the CBO in the years ahead.
Hello, I'm Sally Morton, Executive Vice President of Knowledge Enterprise at Arizona State University. I think I'm most impressed with the way the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes provides solutions to the world's biodiversity crisis through a transdisciplinary lens. And in that way, the center is changing the way the world solves problems to support a thriving people, a thriving planet, and a thriving society.
I'm Kevin Dooley from the Sustainability Consortium and the W.P. Carey Business School at ASU. And I want to say a hearty congratulations on 10 years to CBO. I've had such a wonderful time working with Leah, Jack, Aaron, Miranda, and Gwen over the past decade. I've respected your science-based approach, and I've learned so much as a supply chain person who didn't know about landscapes. You have taught me so much about how to look at the landscape from an ecological systems perspective, and I appreciate that. And done so much to sensitize me to the challenges that we have in ocean sustainability. The Sustainability Consortium and I look forward to working for another decade together.
Happy anniversary, ASU Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. I remember fondly working on our project back in 2017 at SUSINC at the University of Maryland with Leah Gerber et al., in which we tried to increase transparency in decision-making about the very limited funding we have for endangered species recovery. Here at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we are grateful for creative minds and experienced structured decision-making minds to help us think through that. I'm proud that we came up with a tool that we're now experimenting with here in fiscal 2024 as we look to future years with perhaps even more limited funding for endangered species recovery. So optimizing that is certainly something we look to in the future, thanks to the ASU Center. So again, congratulations on your anniversary, and thank you for the years of collaboration we've had together. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, congratulations, Dr. Leah Gerber and your entire team at the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes on 10 years of work. I know that you and your team have remained diligent in working towards conservation and environmental justice. I am excited about what's the next decade going to bring for you, especially since your center and mine collaborated on a one-of-a-kind program that was targeting how young people from underrepresented communities can not only understand conservation and environmental justice, but think about it differently as they lead the ideals and ideas for the next decade. So I wish you and your team the very best. And again, congratulations and kudos for those accomplishments and those yet to come.
This is Daniela Rake from Conservation International. I'm very sorry I can't be there to celebrate with you, but I did want to take this opportunity to congratulate you on 10 wonderful years of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. I remember those early days of building the partnership between CI and CBO and ASU more broadly, and it really is thanks to CBO that we've been able to do so many incredible things, the professors of practice, and much, much more. And I look forward to many years of future collaboration. Congratulations!
My name is Miro Honzak, and I am one of the 6 Conservation International Professors of Practice that were involved by the Center for Biodiversity Outcome to share their experience with ASU students. We co-developed and taught a course called Conservation Science in Practice and involved students in projects led by Conservation International around the world. I think this was a brilliant idea that benefited students who were able to get first-hand experience from the field. My involvement outlived the 2-year time allocated for this endeavor and continued to present day. I kept in touch with the connections I made during that time and continued research that we started. I'm proud to be one of the center affiliates and will always value the friendly collaborative space that it provides. I miss you all. Bye, and hopefully see you soon.
Hi, my name is Amy Scoville-Weaver, and I was a project manager for the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes in 2016 to 2018. And my favorite CBO memory is the Conservation International Partnership. It was a wonderful partnership that CBO was able to bring on that helped spur new science, new research, but also brought 6 Conservation International scientists to ASU to directly teach students about conservation in practice. And we hosted a 2-year-long class and had each scientist come and speak for 2 weeks. And it was wonderful. It was allowed the students to be able to interact with these scientists, to pursue future professional development and internships with them and fellowships. And it wouldn't have been possible without CBO. So really happy that CBO invested in this partnership. And I was really honored and proud to be a part of it.
Hi there, this is Greg Watson from Bayer Crop Science. I just wanted to say congratulations for the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes on the 10-year anniversary. And I'm very happy that we were able to collaborate on an Endangered Species Act project. Very important to have a strong academic voice engaged in the space. And it was great to work with Leah Gerber and others in the center on that project. Best of luck in the next 10 years.
Hi there, it's Beth Polidoro. Sorry I couldn't be there with you in person today, but I did want to send a video about my time with CBO. And I would say one of my favorite things about CBO is that I think it gives all of us who either teach or work with or research anything to do with biodiversity conservation, it gives us a home at ASU where we can all come together and meet each other and work together and collaborate. And I really do appreciate that.
Getting to work with CBO really transformed my graduate school experience. I was able to talk with practitioners from Conservation International and other institutions, learn more about their careers while getting to collaborate on impactful applied conservation research. It was definitely an amazing community to be a part of, and I'm so excited that I had that opportunity.
Congratulations to the entire team at CBO for this incredibly impressive milestone. It's been a privilege to be able to be part of this community, and I personally have very many reasons to be thankful to the center. The first is that they were one of the main reasons why I came to ASU in the first place. Without them, I probably wouldn't have connected to the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, who were major collaborators for my dissertation work. And I also probably would not have connected with my current employers, the Electric Power Research Institute, who I got to work with through the center as well. Overall, I think CBO plays an incredibly pivotal role on ASU's campus. They not only provide students with the incredibly important skills to become great researchers and scientists, but they also provide them with the skills to put those ideas and innovation into practice. I think the ability to implement science in the real world is incredibly vital now more than ever, and I really hope that this is the first of many decadal celebrations for CBO to come.
Hi, I'm Jason Landrum, a Senior Program Officer with the Lenfest Ocean Program. Over the years, CBO has helped build local capacity to inform conservation action with knowledge, derived from a variety of different local experts, leaders, and community members. It's a difficult task to build a shared understanding of what's happening in the world around us, what information we need to better understand what's going on, and how we work together to fill those knowledge gaps and make evidence-based decisions. Through our work with Leah and her team at CBO and the Galapagos, they've stressed an inclusive, participatory approach to co-designing and co-producing useful and usable knowledge from the beginning. Not only has this resulted in more informed decision-making in the region, it has also catalyzed more active participation and leadership by local experts and communities that are shaping that shared understanding of the world and how to apply knowledge to develop and execute solutions to current and future challenges. Happy 10-year celebration, CBO, and keep up the good work.
CBO has made possible my postdoc in the US as a first experience in the country. I was surrounded by amazing humans with beautiful hearts and values. I'm grateful for this once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wish you a very happy birthday, CBO!
Congratulations, Center for Biodiversity Outcomes in your 10th anniversary. This is Percy Summers from CI Peru. It's been such a pleasure to be working alongside all of you for so long and in so many fronts. Definitely my favorite moment has been being able to spend time in campus, sharing with the students all of our research, being part of a group of CI scientists, leading the conservation science course. That was definitely a highlight. But we're doing so many other exciting things as well today, collaborating in so many research projects with the Amazon Business Alliance, of course. We hope to continue collaborating. We enjoy a lot being partners in these projects. And once again, congratulations and hope to see you all very soon.
All right, well, that was fun. That was really, really fun. Thank you to Abby and team for putting together the video. That was a wonderful tribute. All right, so we're gonna be transitioning to our panels. And as I mentioned, our panels are going to be structured around our 3 strategic pillar areas. Before inviting up the panels, I would like to, for those of you who are joining us and would like to contribute to the future of CBO and what we're going to be working on over the next decade, we have set up these easels throughout the room, and we'll be distributing sticky notes. So please jot down your ideas. There are sticky notes on little tables near the easels, and they'll be passed around. So as you listen to the panels, you'll be hearing a lot of provocative ideas and questions and thoughts, and we really, really want your feedback. That's part of the goal. So thank you again for joining, and with that, I would like to invite up our first panel.
Okay, so this first panel aligns with our first strategic pillar at CBO, as Leah said. So this is centering biodiversity in the world's decision-making. I'm Gwen Iacona. I'm the Assistant Director at Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, and these lovely panelists will all be talking about ideas around this general topic. So, centering biodiversity in the world's decision-making. I wanted to stick up this picture here, and I'm a bit amused because the pictures at the top are my general pictures of biodiversity, and the pictures at the bottom are Leah's general pictures of biodiversity. And you'll notice they are completely different taxonomic groups, but that's okay, because when we talk about biodiversity, what we are talking about, as Peter Schlosser also said, is this sort of underlying web of life, the web of life that sort of enables life on this planet and everything that we care about and love. So we care about biodiversity writ large, and then in particular, we're interested in how do we make that, bridge that gap between this biodiversity that we all care about and many, many, many other people on the planet also care about, and the decision-making around all types of things in the world that often seems to not consider biodiversity in the types of decisions that result in the planet that we're living in right now. So when we're talking about decision making, we're talking about people at all levels, government, corporations, individuals, making decisions about actions they are doing in their daily lives and choices that they might make that influence land use patterns, broader supply chain issues, all of these types of things that have biodiversity consequences that really need to be considered if we're going to protect biodiversity going forward. So within the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, we tend to do a lot of our thinking in a structured decision-making framework. And a structured decision-making framework, I tend to think of it as just sort of a logical overlay for thinking broadly about life. So when we're talking about structured decision-making, we're talking about how do we think broadly about the problems that we're looking at, what are the potential options that are out there, and how do you choose between these options in order to get the things that you are looking for. And using this framework to guide the work that we are doing really helps when we are trying to bridge that gap between the decision makers and the decisions that they're making and these things that they actually often do care about but haven't figured out how to incorporate into the decision making itself. So our panel today is all talking about ideas around the science underlying decision making and also the action that results from decisions that people make and the biodiversity consequences of those actions. So our lovely panelists here, let's see, I think, yes. So Caitlin is going to be the first panelist in our Centering Biodiversity and Decision-Making discussion.
Thank you. All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you for that, Gwen. I'm so excited to be here. Today, I'd like to share a little bit of research that I do around judgment and decision-making, specifically on these sorts of often controversial climate, conservation, and environmental issues, and specifically thinking about one pathway through which individuals become kind of more informed, can become more informed about these issues, specifically social media communications. Let's see if I can work this correctly. Fantastic. All right, so polling suggests that a large proportion of Americans get their news from social media. And as I'm sure many of you know, things like climate, conservation, environment are often topics of social media misinformation, right? Whether that takes the form of so-called fake news articles or simply catchy memes. And so the prevalence of misinformation on these topics can pose challenges for informed decision-making on biodiversity, climate, and environmental issues. Some of my prior research has sought to quantify this, finding that exposure to misinformation on climate change can decrease belief in climate change, even when that misinformation is debunked. But there are things we can do, right? There are things that we can do to slow the spread of misinformation on social media. Another experiment, again, a laboratory experiment conducted with some colleagues, found that simple interventions, so asking people to consider guidelines for what they consider to be quality news. Do I recognize the source? Is this written in a professional manner? Can slow the spread of misinformation, can decrease the likelihood of sharing misinformation amongst both those who believe in climate change as well as amongst those who doubt it. So while misinformation on social media may prove a challenge, right, may pose risks for informed decision-making around these issues that we all here care about so much, right, there are also potential positives to social media, right? The promise of social media as a so-called town square where people can engage with diverse others around these important policy topics and challenges. So in another study that my colleagues and I recently ran, we conducted an experiment. We randomly assigned participants to read a discussion about a climate change policy between two unnamed, and completely made up, these are hypothetical, this is a laboratory experiment, but between two policy advocates, a Democrat and a Republican. And what we did in this experiment was we manipulated two things: whether or not these debaters were providing substantive reasoning behind their arguments for and against a climate change policy, as well as whether or not they were speaking to each other in a civil tone, whether they were being respectful or disrespectful toward each other. And one of the outcomes of this study that we found interesting and potentially concerning was that speaking civilly might be more effective for fostering trust in communicators than providing substantive information, right? And this might be a concern in that, right, even in these debates over real policies moving out of the realm of misinformation, those on social media might be susceptible to influence from those who speak civilly but say little of substance. So collectively, this research, I think, suggests that there's great importance to continue to study the communications that people are engaging with on social media on these important issues, both to better understand the potential negative effects, as well as to ask, how can we harness social media to support effective communication and decision-making on these issues? And with that beep, I believe that my time is up. So thank you all. And I will pass it on to you.
Olivia is next. Olivia, can you introduce yourself, please?
Is this working? Hello? Okay. Hi, my name is Olivia. I am a fifth-year PhD. I'm graduating in like a week with my PhD, basically. Almost a graduate, yeah. And I'm here to talk today a little bit about the importance of partnerships and developing more of like a common language to help achieve a maximized conservation impact. So for my dissertation, a lot of my research focused on the Endangered Species Act specifically and how we can use that policy to improve how species are protected within the US context. And one of the things I was really interested in was how partners were engaging both on their own and also together, and what they like thought of each other, and how they perceived the relationships. So my final dissertation chapter, I interviewed people from different nonprofits. So these are just like examples of some of the conservation nonprofits that exist. And I also interviewed some Fish and Wildlife Services employees, and to figure out what kind of there might be an alignment in terms of partnerships and where there might be some kind of disconnects. And I found it was really interesting, still working on writing up the paper for that, which is really cool. But I wanted to highlight a few interesting findings here for you all today. One is that there seems to be a lack of consensus on what conservation and recovery mean, which I thought was super interesting because legally, conservation and recovery under the Endangered Species Act means the same thing, but only 3 of the 30 practitioners I interviewed thought that they were the same thing. All the other ones thought they were different, sometimes thinking in opposites. So it's interesting that all these professionals are coming to conservation decision-making spaces with different definitions of what recovery and conservation even are. We've also been finding that these types of organizations are leaning into the idea of more focusing beyond just individual species and focusing on social issues as well, and the need for people to realize that we can't just look at conservation in a vacuum and just at a species level. We need to look at the social issues that are implicated as well. Also, one of the really interesting things I found here was there are often institutional barriers within either nonprofits or the government itself that can make it difficult for successful teamwork to occur, and it can make it hard for individuals who are coming from these different places of values and these different social norms and expectations to get on the same page with recovery. And then lastly, I found though that on an individual level, a lot of these conservation practitioners are all coming from a very similar space, right? They all really care about endangered species. They all really want to see species recover. And so if we can leverage those personal values a little bit more, that can help us kind of maybe rework the system and rework our partnerships. So just a little preview of what that is. And I'll pass it on. Next one.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Next is Shirley Ann. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Shirley Ann Baravesh, and I'm an assistant professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management. So a little bit of a stretch from the panelists here. But I want to commend CBO before I start by saying, typically we don't hear biodiversity and business in the same sentence. And when we think about biodiversity, we stick to the science of it and the scientists. And so it's great that Leah and team have recognized that there's a lot more beyond just those who actually care and can study this. In fact, businesses are some of the biggest culprits, right, and drivers of biodiversity loss. So I just want to preface with that. In terms of research, so we started off in a pretty nascent state. It's been about a decade now since organizations, businesses, corporations in particular have recognized that biodiversity loss is a big deal. It means supply chain risks. It means that there are going to be issues in the future if they don't think about where their resources are being sourced from. So it's been a conversation for about 10 years now. So we thought, okay, it's been 10 years. Let's see what businesses are actually doing when it comes to biodiversity and considering ways in which they can mitigate that loss. And so we pulled out a couple of leaders in the sustainability space from the WBSCD, which is one of the rankings of sustainability corporations, and looked at their reports just to see, what are they doing with regards to biodiversity conservation preservation. Only about 40% of those organizations were actually doing something with regards to biodiversity. And then when you dug even deeper, it was all pretty surface level. So we also coded these activities by whether it was just a mention, right, a talk about something related to biodiversity or a resource or a natural resource, whether it was actually related to an activity that was taking place, and whether there were outcomes associated with those mentions of biodiversity. And only about 15% of that were actual outcomes. Another 15 were related to actions, and the majority of it was just talk. Now, this is not a new thing. I don't think it shocks any of us out here, because at the end of the day, reporting is really that. It is to signal to customers, to stakeholders that we're thinking about something, we're doing something. We might not actually be doing as much as we say we want to, but it's a way to signal to stakeholders. So we're now at a phase where we're looking further at this new set of organizations, which have very recently, just in the last year, actually pledged to biodiversity challenges. So with the TNFD, with the SBTN targets, these are companies that have stood up and said, we are going to do something about this. And they've just now released their first round of reports. So our next phase is, what are these guys actually doing? And looking at that against the frameworks that exist. There's a number of frameworks in the last few years that have opened up for organizations. So looking at those frameworks, looking at what those leaders, those first movers in the space are doing, and recognizing sort of what are the gaps and what are the challenges that we can enable or help organizations move forward in this space. And that's 9 seconds left. Ooh.
Thank you very much, Shirley-Ann. Eric.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take those 9 seconds to congratulate CBO on a decade of excellence, even though that's not even enough time to get started. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and Complex Systems. I'd like to start with a basic question. If President Crow came to you and said, we need your help to reduce heat deaths throughout Arizona this year, do you have something to add to that conversation? With you, your education, your talents, your networks, can you contribute to making Arizona safer? My guess is probably. But do you know how if you're not asked? How are you improving the communities of which you're a part of? And that's the central theme line to a lot of the research that we do, whether it's the MacArthur Network, whether it's our work with the White House, or whether it's our work with patient communities. And so the logo up there on Opening Pathways was a collection of health communities that did DIY health. And so specifically, we worked with a group of people that had type 1 diabetes, and their motto is, we're not waiting for the healthcare industry to come along and address the challenges that we're facing on a daily basis. And so what they ended up doing is recognizing that they could build their own artificial pancreas with off-the-shelf devices like a continuous glucose monitor, a Raspberry Pi device, and an insulin pump. and they came up with a pancreas that's better than your or my pancreas, but not just for themselves, but then they shared it with other families and other communities and said, this is how we can take ownership over our communities, over our lives. And now there's thousands and thousands of people that have this sort of artificial pancreas. I was gonna say next slide, and then I realized it's in my control. A similar theme is looking at this community, which is Boulder Ridge, Arizona. And they were very concerned with whether or not that mine on the left side of the picture was poisoning them. This is a senior community that sort of moved in with a promise that that mine would be shut down, but the mine was not shut down. And so working with Darlene Cavalier, a faculty member within the School of Future of Innovation and Society, we created a citizen science environment that allowed for them to test out on a continuous basis how much air pollution was in their air. And they were convinced before they worked with us that it was the explosions that were happening multiple times a day that were causing respiratory distress. But the data didn't support that. What the data did support is that the trucks that were going in and out on the unpaved road were kicking up tremendous amounts of dust and particulate matter that were coinciding with the incidences of them having respiratory distress. They then used this information to advocate for paving the road as well as accelerating the shutdown of the mine. But what you see as a theme between these two examples is if you are part of the process of discovering the knowledge, you're far more likely to act on it, which was a very different dynamic than had we as scientists came in and said, yes, you're being polluted by X. We created the conditions that allowed for them to discover for themselves. So as we think about sort of how this affects CBO, imagine President Crow comes to you and says, hey, the challenge that I have for you is how do we stop species eradication of 1 million species? What do you do? What can you propose? You probably have great ideas, but you also recognize this is an overwhelming task. And so the challenge really that I'm facing is not just how do I solve it, but how do I create the conditions that unleash a cognitive, democratic, and scientific surplus of people taking stewardship of their own communities, figuring out under what conditions there is a need, and then having a pathway in order to be able to act to take or create the future that they want to for their species, for their environment, and for their community. And that's what we're working on collectively here. The final thing I'll lead you with is all this research has led us to a big question that we ask everyone. If you could double the amount of knowledge or the amount of curiosity in society, which would you choose and which would you think is more valuable? 90% of people say curiosity. But most of our systems are designed to double the amount of knowledge or to build the amount of knowledge without thinking, well, then what? The amount of data that we have is exponentially increasing every couple of years. The amount of problems has not went down exponentially every couple of years. So maybe the bottleneck isn't that we don't have enough data, but we don't have enough curiosity or pathways to actually improve our communities. Dave? That one.
Somebody's taking over. Okay, I'm going to speak for a moment to just sort of try to tie some of these comments together and to place CBO's work in the context of ASU, in the context of our work in Global Futures Laboratory and sustainability. But before I start, I do want to congratulate Leah and the entire team on this 10-year anniversary. And I'm going to do an unscripted follow-up to Eric's comments because many years ago, probably more than 10 years ago, I was over at Decision Theater and I was sitting next to a good colleague, friend of mine who works at ASU in the field of public health. And while we were sitting there, she got a phone call from President Crow. And she hung up and she seemed a little frazzled. And I said, what happened? And at the time, there was an Ebola outbreak that had been just occurring in East Africa. And she said, well, President Crow called me and told me to call the World Health Organization and offer to help. And I just sat there and sat with this for a moment, and I thought, this is, on one hand, kind of the most pretentious thing I've ever heard. Like, what could one professor from ASU and ASU in general even do to help? On the other hand, I thought, this is exactly the spirit of this university. Like, there's a big challenge, there's a crisis, we offer to help. You know, we put our hand up and offer to help. And it sort of leads me into the role of CBO, because CBO exemplifies, it really carries the flag for ASU's charter, for the university's focus on conducting research and discovery of public value. And so as Leah was talking about, the work that the center does is framed, is driven by the challenges that are faced by practitioners, by corporations, by governments. So that's the core of defining how the knowledge is co-produced with those partners. So it really also embodies the charter principle of taking responsibility for the communities that we serve. So as Eric was using the example of heat or working in the mine, there are these issues. We step up and we say, how can a university contributing knowledge in partnership with these other organizations help develop solutions? If you look then at the university's design aspirations, 8, now 9 guiding principles for the university, CBO really also exemplifies several of those. So fusing intellectual disciplines. We've heard from everything from conservation science to strategic decision making to social media and network analysis. CBO is a place that knits together intellectual contributions from across the university, and this transdisciplinary scientific approach, when combined with external partners, stakeholders, is what defines the ethos of CBO, and that's one of the design principles. Another one of our design principles is to engage globally, and CBO really also exemplifies and carries the flag for that type of work. And finally, a third of the 9 principles is to enable student success. And Olivia is a great example of a student who has used the framework, the architecture, the intellectual infrastructure of CBO to advance her own career and to make a contribution not only individually but to the center and to the problem set. And then finally, I'll just say personally, Lee may not even know this, but my dissertation research, which was completed 22 years before Olivia's, was focused on the use of science in conservation decision-making. And so I focused on threatened and endangered species in the Pacific Northwest, specifically salmon recovery in the Pacific Northwest. And my research was looking at how science is utilized within policy and decision-making in that area. So supporting CBO brings me back to some of my earliest scholarship. And so it's very personally rewarding to be associated and contribute to this community.
Thank you so much, Dave. I did not know that. That's great. You're part of our... So what we're going to do now is we are going to have a panel discussion. So I have a starting question that I will give to the panelists to start them off, but then we really want this to be audience engagement as well. So at any point in time, feel free to, do we have microphones out there? Okay, anyway, put your hand up and yell. But we'd like to have the audience ask questions of the panelists as well. So I'm going to start us off here with a somewhat broad and very leading question. But really what we're doing with this question is encouraging our panelists to give us some more of their insight into the things that they are thinking about every day on how to solve this biodiversity crisis. So my leading question, which I'm going to ask to all of you, and so just whoever wants to go first in answering this question, that's fine. What innovation is needed to address the extinction crisis, and how do we cultivate it? Who wants to go first? Shirley Ann? I see you turning on your microphone.
It's just playing at the mic.
But,
okay. I would step away. I would go one step before innovation, and I think the biggest thing is awareness. I think a lot of people don't know that we are in this crisis. The greater public, I teach a group of business students, and everyone knows about climate change. Everyone understands it's the biggest threat that we've seen thus far, and we're all ready and willing to push towards it. Businesses, the exact same thing. The moment you mention biodiversity loss, it's like, oh yeah, what's up with that? Where's the big problem there? And so I think awareness is the big thing, and the moment that we can connect ourselves and our future to the fact that we are losing a multitude of species at a rate that we've never seen before, when we can connect ourselves to that, then it will lead to this innovation. The matter of fact is a lot of us just aren't aware, and because of that, the innovation, it can't happen yet.
Thank you so much for that. And Eric is going to pick up, I think, from...
Yeah, exactly. I want to build on that because the idea of sort of how do you make aware captures one of the central challenges the Center for Smart Cities or Regions is addressing is what, if made visible, would change your perspective of something. And so is there a data, is there a relationship, is there an awareness that if made visible, you would navigate the world in a different way? And that is especially true of the challenges like climate and species that are the frog in the pot type analogy, where you know that there's a change that's happening, but you don't necessarily see the tangible effects. And so could you use techniques in order to make concrete, approachable, and consequential the enormity of the challenges that we're facing, because the way that we're designed sort of as humans makes this an incredibly difficult problem to wrap our head around or to even think is significant because it is slow moving, because it's difficult to understand what my challenges will do. And so again, what we sort of ask regularly is like, what piece of information, what change in the relationship, what pathway sort of would allow for you to feel like you had agency in actually making a meaningful difference in the problem?
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'll pop on as well. Thank you. So to build on those points, I actually want to bring in, I think, one of your favorite topics, which is decision support. So the idea being that, okay, let's imagine that we've got people aware of this crisis. What can they do? And so thinking about using the tools of structured decision-making, decision support techniques to help people not only understand that there's a problem, but understand the different options that we face, right? Thinking this from a decision-making perspective of how can we use tools like decision support to help people identify, right? What options do I have? What are the risks and benefits of those options? What are the costs? To what extent do those outcomes align with my goals and my values? And so thinking about ways in which we can kind of foster that sort of understanding to translate that awareness into action, I think is also a very key point here to think about.
So Gwen, I'll follow on that, because who is then using those decision support tools and who's making the decisions and how are we doing it is another major need for innovation, because our policy and governance systems are not adequate to address the scale, scope, and speed of the challenges that we're facing in biodiversity crisis, climate crisis. These interconnected global challenges transcend geopolitical boundaries. And I know, Leah and others are heavily involved in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and other things, which is the worst conceivable global governance process you could imagine, except for every other thing that we have, right? And so we need to innovate the responsiveness, scale, speed, and effectiveness of international and global governance processes to address biodiversity and the related crises. And otherwise, the best information, curiosity, decision support systems, if they don't have a mechanism by which to have that outcome, then they're not going to be effective.
Thank you so much. I do think everything everybody just said right now is so related, because Shirley Ann, I'm totally with you in that when we say biodiversity, people don't know what we're talking about. But I do also think what you were saying, Kaylin, is that people do care. They just don't know. They don't know the language that we're speaking, and they don't know what the sort of actions and opportunities and things like that are. And it's all this sort of policy really high up level that doesn't help translate it to the general public. And so I really do see that as our role here at ASU in general and Center for Biodiversity Outcomes in particular, is how do we bridge that gap? This is what we think the innovation is, right? It's like we want to help people realize that the things that they care about, there are potential for pathways forward, and decision theoretic approach is really helpful at helping us figure out what those potentials for pathways forwards are. And as Eric was saying, people care about things that they identify as important within themselves and identify solutions for going forward. So I really love how this conversation sort of ties it all together. So now I wanted to open it up. Is there anybody in the audience who has a question for our panelists?
We are professors. We'll call on people. So if you don't ask questions.
Yes, does somebody want to take a hack at that?
Sounds like a Caitlin question to me. Just
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's a great question. There's a lot of work thinking about the ways in which trust in institutions shape decision-making, shape trust in the information coming from those institutions, and in turn shape action. So I think to summarize the consensus on that literature, yes, trust certainly matters. And thinking about how to build trust, I think, is one important challenge, right? I mentioned at the start of my presentation that, especially in America, but globally, many of these challenges surrounding biodiversity, conservation, climate, environment can be quite controversial, right? Some of these policy options that are presented can prompt both strong support and strong opposition. And we start to look at the drivers of those kind of diverging viewpoints. Oftentimes, differential trust plays an important role. And so thinking about how to, as scientists, right, build that warranted trust in science. And I say warranted there for a reason, right? How can we as scientists act in a way that is responsible and open and transparent, in a way that reveals kind of the power of the scientific approach to better understand these challenges and pose options? And I actually want to bring this back to Eric's point about the options in terms of thinking about how we can bring citizens into the scientific process. How can we scientists move beyond what we consider to be the questions and the solutions and really engage with communities and their knowledge and their understanding throughout the whole scientific process? How can we make communities partners in the scientific endeavor? And how can that in turn help build that trust in science that we know from survey research, for example, that has been in decline, more so amongst certain segments of the population than others, but that has been declined. So I think thinking about ways to build that trust, ways for scientists to demonstrate accountability and to think about how we can communicate and engage with communities in a way that really sincerely engages rather than talks to is going to be really important for this sort of innovation that Gwen's question points out in terms of being needed to address the extinction crisis.
Yeah, go ahead, Olivia, because I think you asked these questions of people.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Going along with that, I think when I was interviewing the different practitioners, I asked them all what are important values you consider in partnerships, and number one was communication, and then transparency and trust were really close behind. So going off of what Caitlin said, we need to just not only cultivate these with communities, but within ourselves too, because I feel like there's often a lot of times where these organizations, we're talking at each other and we're not really listening and hearing where each other is coming from. So we really need to really focus on building those relationships within our own networks too, in addition to the community.
Yes, question.
But I'm going to ask it anyway, because it's on the agenda elsewhere. We've heard a lot about social structures and social innovations and structured decision-making, and I love all that. You know I love all that. There are folks elsewhere, maybe some of them are at Harvard, maybe some of them are named George, who want to address the extinction crisis through processes of genetic manipulation, synthetic biology, recreating mammoths to help change the nature of the steppe and the permafrost and fight climate change in that way. Is that kind of innovation at all on CBO's agenda? And might it need to be as that form of scientific innovation becomes increasingly powerful?
So I'll answer that question from CBO's perspective, but then I'm going to let other people comment on this because I think that is a great question. And when we're talking about innovation, can these sort of crazy technological advances be the solution? I think they can be part of a solution, but it is not the entire solution. And I know this because when we ask people about their objectives for conservation, they're widely varying, right? Like we have a lot of different objectives and we have a lot of different things that people care about. And if you specifically care about, rewilding permafrost, that could be a very, possible action that you could choose. But it is not an action that gets you benefits on a bunch of different other objectives. So, working in this way with collaborative decision-making and trying to solve a problem that really is a social problem that has a whole bunch of different angles means there isn't one solution. There's a bunch of solutions, and working together, we want to try and figure out how do we pick the set of solutions that best fits our goals together as society.
So I just want to say, have you seen Jurassic Park? Yes. So I'm going to speak from the technological point of view because at Thunderbird we talk a lot about technology. It's one of the big things that every student walks in the door talking about. And it's basically the question of, can technology save us? At the end of the day, technology will have a huge role to play, and no one's denying that. There's some really amazing things happening. Sounds crazy, but it's amazing at the end of the day if we think about it. And as Gwen said, it is part of the solution, and we just need to figure out what's the right way to utilize those technologies. So perhaps it's not bringing back the mammoths or the dinosaurs or whatever else it is, but there are elements in there where we can perhaps save certain genetic varieties of certain species that are essential to us as human beings. And so thinking about these, and yes, the idea on a whole just sounds crazy and scary, but really we need to think about what pieces of that technology can we utilize to actually bring about some sustainable future.
I'll just say quickly, I think that it probably should be on CBO's agenda because there is an increasing discourse around what historically might have been called geoengineering. Now people talk about planetary scale interventions. These types of interventions are a growing part of the discourse on this type of in addressing these global challenges. And if CBO is not at least engaged in the intellectual discussion about this, then you're ceding that ground to proponents of these kinds of interventions, which may have plausible potential positive impacts, but certainly have lots of potential unintended consequences and second and third order effects that need to be considered in a very, thinking about the 9th design aspiration of responsible innovation. We need to be thinking about what can CBO say about responsible innovation in responding to these kinds of proposals.
Yes, and I think sort of using tools from decision theory actually are really helpful for thinking about when are situations like this cost-effective and useful. And in the name of full disclosure, several years ago, I did an analysis looking at what is the cost effectiveness of de-extinction, and it is not. It doesn't line up with things that we can do these days, but there might be times when it does. So I'm saying there are tools that can help you make these decisions, and determine when is it worthwhile to pursue and when is it not worthwhile to pursue. And Leah wants to comment as well.
I can't resist. So I guess my thoughts in response to your question, Dave. It's not something that we have fully plunged into, and I would say the traditional paradigm in conservation science is very much that the idea of de-extinction. Let's see how I could put this. It misses the point to some extent, because we're not just trying to save genes in museums, but species represent whole systems. And so by rewilding, that misses the problem. That said, I think in the same way as Dave indicated, when we talk about the climate problem, yes, we can advocate for reforestation and protecting natural capital to hold the carbon on Earth, but that's not going to solve the problem in itself. We also need to innovate engineering solutions. So I think probably we could say the same about the future of biodiversity. At present, it's not very cost effective and feasible. I'm looking at Risa because this is her dissertation research, but I don't know. Do you want to add anything at all?
Just because I'm being called out. No, I guess the only thing I want to add, I think everyone's comments have been really thoughtful. And I mean, the people, George Church has the money to do this, and they're gonna do what they're gonna do. So I feel like it's not worth trying to stop them necessarily. But I think, at least for me, where I want to intervene is the kind of messaging that this is a wholesale solution to an extinction crisis is the part that's most concerning to me. So, you know, hopefully they'll be cautious in doing what they do, and everyone else can be part of the conversation of regulating it. But I think especially from conservation practitioners, some of the most important work we can do is focusing on what other solutions are needed in addition, and not letting this come off as a wholesale fix.
Okay, yes, another question in the back.
Brought up that would be interesting to unpack a little bit is the sort of technology and the double-edged sword of it. I think a lot about in the Southwest, for instance, like one of the reasons why there's a lot of conserved areas in the Western United States, I would say, is because there's no water. And so I think about things, you know, in some ways we're pushing forward these solutions for sustainability that need technology, like, you know, if we think about like, oh, if desalinization became like magically super energy efficient and economically viable, then we would have probably exacerbated biodiversity problems in the Western US. And so for me, I guess then I meditate about like, well, it very much is a question of values and what do we value when those things become available and exploitable. And so I guess meandering question, but I'm wondering how you think about that balance of technology and technological solutions, and then also just kind of this idea of telling people what the values should be versus finding them themselves, which you've touched on.
Thank you, that's a great question, and it really does get at this pillar of research that we're doing in CBO, which is we just want biodiversity to be part of the values that are being considered in these types of decisions, right? Because it's true, we don't want to tell people do this or else, but it's how do we bring biodiversity into these decisions so that they can be considered along with the other things that we have to weigh. We have to make trade-offs usually when we're dealing with crises or difficult ways forward. Does anybody else want to add on here?
I'm still struggling with meditating on viciousness. I thought you were supposed to clear your mind of stuff. To me, it ties together a question that came a little bit earlier, which is about accountability and about rethinking about who is accountable for this challenge. And you have a collection of people that think that there are other groups or other people or other Harvard professors that are going to come along and solve this challenge. Versus, how do we change the conversation to recognize what is our role within the broader conversation, both as an individual and as a member of larger organizations that can do something about it? And then what's the responsible role that I can take? We, in Arizona, talk about the heat all the time because it's around us and it's constant and it's dominating within our mindset. But I rarely have had a conversation about the hummingbirds and whether or not the diversity of them or the birds that are in my neighborhood or the insects that are around are increasing or decreasing. How do we change the conversations that we have so that it becomes a consistent part of how we think about the health of the societies that we play in, so that we have shared accountabilities at multiple different scales, and that we're working not in terms of top-down or bottom-up, which are false dichotomies, but in the connective tissue between the two, so that the top-down is creating sort of the best science and sharing it, and the bottom-up is customizing it for local conditions, local values, and being able to reflect on what is the future that our region wants that's consistent with both our past, our priorities, and the type of people and communities that we want to build as we move forward.
Thank you. Okay, oh, is there one more person? Okay.
Thanks to the panel. I'm just wondering, in terms of the biodiversity crisis, what are your thoughts of competing pressures on biodiversity? For instance, we have population is growing, so there'll be more demand for urbanization or even like food production, which also puts a lot of pressure on biodiversity. And this is just bound to continue in the future as population growth.
I'll just make one quick comment. I think that question that you're raising brings up the issue, related to both accountability and equity and justice, and particularly distributive justice, and the idea of, what actions among what actors, especially state actors, have been most responsible for leading us to the biodiversity crisis, and how, through whatever mechanisms are possible, including, financing, payments, loans, et cetera, that we have to enable success, prosperity, and support for those countries that especially have been least responsible for leading us into the biodiversity crisis. And that's going to be a big part, whether it's climate or biodiversity, that's a big part of the next generation of solutions in this space.
I'm actually going to stop us now. This is the end of the time we have for this panel. So can everybody help me thanking this panelist?
Okay, everyone, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our next panel, focused on our strategic pillar, focused on training the next generation. Jana Goebel, our program lead, will facilitate the discussion.
Thank you, Leah. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Jana Goebel. I'm Assistant Professor of Sustainability Education in the School of Sustainability and College of Global Futures. And I'm also really honored to be the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes Program Lead for Education. So I'm happy to moderate this panel today. And in this panel, we're going to discuss training the next generation of biodiversity leaders. The question that I'll use to frame our conversation at the end will be, how do we cultivate hope in facing the extinction crisis? And our panelists today are Nika Guecci. She's Executive Director of University Engagement. Nope, is that right? Wow. I also know you're a mindfulness expert.
Yes, for the Center for Mindfulness, Compassion, and Resilience.
For the Center for Mindfulness, Compassion, and Resilience. And then we have Nana Sarchiva Brown-Wood, a PhD student in sustainability, Mike Schoon, professor and global future scientist, and Risha Snevely, who's a PhD student, and Elizabeth Swanson-Andy, who's joining us from Ecuador as a conservation fellow today. So I will briefly discuss some of our efforts in the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes in terms of education. And with that, thanks so much. So one of the things I want to keep in mind in our framing is why we do this. In the last panel, we talked about technological fixes and what we can be doing. But what I want to keep in mind during the education panel is one of our main jobs is to stop our bad behavior that's causing all these things in the first place. And education is a great place to do that. So our why in education efforts in the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes is to increase access and support for marginalized and minoritized individuals in STEM especially. So we want to see a world in which conservation isn't just for those who can afford to take the risk of working in conservation. This is the work of everyone, and we really want to acknowledge everyone that's doing this work and support them. With that, we hope to encourage safer, more just, more equitable futures through conservation and sustainability education. So our vision is to, we envision a model of conservation education that supports the passions and limitless futures of a broader and more diverse group of individuals. And I put this picture of me in a pink shirt and sunglasses as a child to tell you that we take inspiration from our own stories and our own lives, and what you're going to hear from these panelists today is why this matters to them. And they're bringing very personal and tangible stories for us to listen to. And while you're listening, I'd like you to think, what gives you hope, or what is your purpose, or what is your why? So what's your inspiration, but also how are you the inspiration for this work too? How do you cultivate hope because and despite the intersecting injustices we face together? So with that, I'm going to start passing it to the other panelists. Thank you. Sure.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Nika Guecci, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Mindfulness, Compassion, and Resilience under the Edson College of Nursing and Health Innovation. And together with the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, we wrote a paper that was published last year that I'll talk about today, and that is about how we can use mindfulness to address the biodiversity crisis. And so mindfulness here is defined as an intentional moment-to-moment awareness of the present moment. It's a way to be here intentionally now and understand ourselves, understand others, and understand the contents of our experience so that we can have a broader perspective of what is truly going on. So in our paper, we talked about the attitudinal foundations of mindfulness, and I won't go through all of them here. There's either 7 or 9, depending on who you talk to. But the foundations are really the underpinnings of how we practice. And so, for example, some of them are patience, acceptance, letting go, and how building upon these foundations can support a mental framework that can help with life's adversities. Acceptance can be a launching point, an intentional space from which to activate solutions to problems. So acceptance in this sense is not just a resignation to fate. It is not a rolling over and just allowing life to happen and to have problems be as they are, right? It's a way to understand them for what they truly are, not what we hope, wish, or fear them to be. And in that case, it provides us that launching point to understand what we can do, understand how we can help, what our strengths and our weaknesses are. And so our efforts in that way will not be fragmented. They will be targeted and not scattered. So in that sense, mindful acceptance of the problem can help us engage in a more viable solution. Ultimately, mindfulness provides us agency in how to respond. So it allows us to have that space between stimulus and response. And stimulus could be anything, internal, our own internal thoughts. It could be external, such as what is going on in the world, the news, everything you see, hear, everybody you come into contact with. And it can provide us that space, which ultimately provides us agency in how we respond and the values that we want to bring into the world. To train the next generation, it's essential to encourage these skills and to model these skills in our own lives so that we can help them cope, so that we can help them have that mental framework to better handle life's challenges and joys as well, to be able to see life's joys. And also remembering that initial passion, wonder, and awe that initially got us into the work that we do, right? Dr. Shioda here at ASU talks about awe. And awe is a spontaneous, unintentional moment of mindfulness that really penetrates the brain in a way that the continuous practice might not. So remembering that sense of awe can circumvent this sense of grief, this sense of anxiety. It produces a powerful reaction in the brain. Okay, well, that's what I had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, just listening to you, I was already feeling like I was in a mindfulness section. So my contributions with the Center for Biodiversity Outcome has primarily been in the focus of the Girls Conserve program. And while the Center for Biodiversity has been involved in training the next generation for the past 10 years, this program has taken an intentional approach in stepping out of just the ASU environment and also connecting with the younger generations out of ASU. One thing the program does, though, is very new. It's a pilot program that we started off a year ago. It's also targeting girls in underserved communities, and although it welcomes boys, we had boys also joining in, but the target was with girls. It's created in a way that enables faculty, students, and staff to mentor and coordinate each other, and I was really inspired by the way this program sought to train us, not just to leave it at the graduate level or within the ASU community, but also show us how to also mentor and be there for the younger generations out of ASU community. This way. Okay, so it was a week-long program that was focusing on mentoring younger high schoolers in environmental conservation. And it was really impactful. We do not have the numbers here, but we had about 27 high schoolers partaking in this program and coming out saying that they would highly recommend this program for others to take part. And it reminds me of the phrase, catch them young and you have them forever. Because if we are able to get these high schoolers now, by the time they are making decisions into colleges, we can have some form of like assurance or a higher degree of potential that will be going into sustainability and conservation pathways and be more centered and focused on trying to figure out solutions that enhance our current environmental crisis. We also saw that students from ASU did not just benefit. We had undergraduate students having theses out of it. I, as a graduate student myself, being involved in evaluating the program, so enhancing my own evaluation skills, and also building that relationship with faculty and also staff. You are learning from both sides, how they are thinking from the administrative point of view and also from the academic point of view. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the results was very outstanding. I could say we had over 87 to 90% of the students wanting to recommend the program again, to encourage much more people in their communities to take part in such a program if it's available. Yeah, our future plans say we do not want it to be just a one-time program, so we are trying to expand our partnership with others. We are seeking more funds and also trying to find ways of following up with people who participate in this program all year long. Yeah.
Great. So to follow Nana talking about working with with high schoolers, I'd like to focus on our undergrads and grad students. Like many faculty here, I suspect that, like myself, one of the main drivers for me going back to higher education, I'd worked for some time and was increasingly concerned with a variety of environmental issues, including and especially biodiversity loss. And I came back to school in part because of this perceived or hopefully actual multiplier effect in which by teaching and working and training students, I would have an effect beyond what I myself might do if I was working just within an organization. So I really take this perspective for us thinking about education. So my work, and this is the second thing that I really wanted to focus on here, my work is on collaboration. We can frame this in terms of collective action. And what I'd really like to hear people talk about at some point during the day, it came up a little bit in the first session, but I'd like to really emphasize this, is collective action is when we, as individuals, take particular actions with a group of people in ways that may often limit ourselves in some way, but to achieve some kind of social outcome that we want to see. And we're talking about some of those outcomes here. One of the things that's really necessary for collective action, and for those that study this know this very well, is the need for a clear vision. And so one of the challenges in this is problems with CBD and other efforts to do something with biodiversity is, what is it that we want to see? And so the problem can seem insurmountable unless we break it down into pieces that I think we can envision and think about the changes and how do we make those steps between the world as it is now and where we want it to get. So the work and the training that my students are doing, the research that we're engaging on together is very much in line with CBO in terms of it being place-based, practitioner-focused. This is work that is co-designed, co-produced, and so on. So the lab group that I run, we focus on a handful of projects, and I just want to focus on a couple of these. We have a number of case studies about environmental collaborations, many of which are going on within the Desert Southwest. We use a particular framework, a context mechanism outcome framework. I won't go into the details on this, but we're using this so we have mechanisms for studying individual cases, what's going on in a particular place at a particular time with a particular group of people, but also ways of aggregating these individual case studies up into broader studies. The other project that's going on now is something that I am far from an expert on, but is very much student-driven and motivated, that a number of the participants in the lab were focused on biocultural conservation, and so we're now exploring this and working on some papers together on that. The final thing that I want to focus on is work that we're doing that goes outside of traditional coursework and classrooms and so on. I've been fortunate enough to facilitate and convene some working groups and collaborative efforts around the state, in particular on wild horse management. This was really fun. It was under the auspices of the U.S. Forest Service and a variety of stakeholder groups. In addition to that, I've become increasingly involved with a group called the Southwest Cousins, the Southwest Collaborative Support Network. And this is a group of collaboratives that are all working together to try to peer learn. And so we're trying to think about how we can, as a research group, help inform them and teach them and learn from what they're doing. And with that, I'll leave it there.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Risa Arias-Schnebly. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about my experience pursuing the Environment and Conservation Leadership certificate, which is a grad certificate that Leah Gerber created to train students in the environmental sciences to communicate with policymakers, the media, and the public. And I'm specifically going to talk about my ability to take science communication classes through this certificate, which I think is incredibly valuable because STEM programs, both at undergraduate and graduate levels, don't really emphasize the importance of communication for scientists at large. which is a huge shame because a lot of scientists are not very good communicators, which people training in science don't often realize how integral communication skills are to what we do, whether it's grant writing or collaborating, but also communicating with the public and communicating with policymakers who need our science to be able to make decisions. And also, being able to talk about our science in an accessible way can help make it more inclusive and demystify the process of what doing science actually looks like. And science communication doesn't just involve talking about it in a way that makes sense to anyone, but also can entail talking about your science in a way that is deeply meaningful. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people who are working in conservation, because this is a field where you have to really deeply care about what you're doing to be putting so much work into it. And I think a lot more people can become invested in conservation efforts and preventing biodiversity loss if they know how to actually take the time to communicate it in a way that is personal and relevant and feels emotional a lot of the time. Yeah, and that can just help people connect. So my experience taking the ECL certificate, I've been able to take the core course, which emphasizes all sorts of aspects of communication and leadership, from trying to pitch stories as a scientist about your work to different outlets, to talking to policymakers and building collaborations. But I've also taken a variety of science communication courses that have trained me in styles like science journalism to literary nonfiction, which is helping me pursue a career, hopefully, as a science writer after my PhD and talking about environmental issues and conservation in a way that I hope can be meaningful and resonant on a more personal level. Because I think in the first panel, everyone was talking a lot about awareness, and I think awareness is important, but there's a whole myriad of communication studies that show that just being exposed to information doesn't always persuade people to actually take action or become invested in things. It also matters how you communicate that information, right? So yeah, I am grateful that there is, because there's also no science communication program even in the journalism school here at ASU. So I'm grateful that the environmental and conservation leadership program is there to be able to start filling that need for scientists to be able to gain these kinds of skills, which I hope we see more of.
That was great. Happy to know that that certificate exists here, because I'll be a student in the fall. So very cool. My name is Elizabeth Virginia Swangsong Andy. I am so happy to be here with you all. Leah met me when I was a little teenager, and David and Jantna have also met me here, and Donovan. So I'm really excited to be here. And today we're going to be looking at exchanging knowing across knowledge systems. Oh, and one more thing that's important. I'm from the Napo Quechua peoples in the Ecuadorian Amazon, from a community of about 200. Everybody's related. Can't date there, so I'm here. And when we're talking about traditional knowledge, for me, it's all about relational knowledge. And this is something that I've learned since I was a kid growing up in my community, but also growing up here in Arizona. I lived back and forth, and I think I was always comparing these different knowledge systems, what I was taught in my community, what I learned from experience, and also just being in the Arizona education system. But today I'm gonna really focus on what I know, which is the traditional relational knowledge. And for us, that's really important to focus on these kind of 4 different categories or variables that you see. And this is a whole ecosystem. This is how I see it, a whole ecosystem with very delicate variables. And really to protect our land, our home, our people, our community, each of these variables are really key. And so the first one, parihulyangana in our language, daily practical work, which in my mom's generation was very different. That was going out to the gardens, that was like hunting and gathering, whole different lifestyle that changed very quickly when I came into the world. And as it's changing now, it's really key that this work needs to be paid nowadays. And so I'm gonna connect that to the 3. So it needs to be daily practical paid work, interacting with youth and elders in our own language and in our territory, so that we're relating to different species, to different plants. And that's really how we work on, I guess, biocultural conservation. And so next I'm going to show you little pictures of my childhood and kind of what this life was. So on the left, you see that's my grandfather, Bartolo, and his name was actually Coto, which is howler monkey. And then he was a great fisher, and that was actually when I was a kid, and that was the last time we ever communally fished. So in my whole life, I was probably about 10, and so much changed when I was about 10. And then that's me with my mom. That's another fish that we haven't really ate since I was a little girl, because a lot of fish we don't really see in our rivers anymore. And then on the left side, I've never been in a room where you can see it on all sides, is my grandmother, who she is a traditional knowledge carrier and works in the gardens and in the islands that are in the river. In this river today, at that point, we used to be able to drink from it, but today it's contaminated by mining. And there's studies that have been done, and they have found heavy metals in it, like mercury. So is our traditional way of life sustainable today? It is not. And so because of this, my parents were actually ahead of their time, and they ended up creating this beautiful learning center and educational center called Iarina, which we've been running for over 20 years. And it's been a place where we've been able to create employment opportunities, education opportunities at the intersection of what this traditional relational knowledge is. And what's really important is that it's in territory, it's using our language, and it's interacting with youth and elders. And now I'm leading that as a president, and that can be hard because I'm still a youth and they are my elders. So like running a place, it's really about balancing the relationships between my own family, but also the relationships with people who want to collaborate with us. You know, we can't do this on our own. And so it's been really beautiful to see over the years professors, researchers, students from ASU, but along other universities as well. And that's how I met Leah when I was a kid, coming and finding and building these solutions together. And one really cool example is this solar canoes against deforestation. We're working on many projects, and I really like this idea of collective governments that you're speaking on, because that's really speaks to what we're doing. And this project right here is in partnership with the School of Sustainability, with David and Jenna here. And we've been working on this for over 2 years now, but recently, this is kind of the first time that we're seeing the solar canoes now in my community. We're being able to use it. It's not tipping over. I don't know how much y'all, because if it tips over, you're fried. So it's been really, really fun. But I think the really cool thing about it are the outcomes. I think it's easy to see, like, why do you need canoes, right? Why do we need solar technology? I mean, Ecuador has been extracting oil for generations now, and it's been really destroying our home and our home forests, and not just like extraction of resources, but also extracting human resources as well. When you are living in a traditional community and you start to see all your uncles leave, they're no longer there, their roles change. And so as a little girl, I was like, how do I bring my family back to my home? And this is one way. It's to create jobs in territory. So the outcomes, we were able to bridge the physical distance between territory and urban life for a lot of communities that didn't have access to cities, to education. So they're my friends, and we were able to have them basically be in territory and continue their relationship with their land, and also bridge traditional knowledge and new research. What's been beautiful to see is seeing my cousins kind of grow and have access now to education, being able to be trained on big projects. And one example is my cousin Clever Vargas, who he grew up basically being told that he needs to go work in the oil industry. So then he went to university and he went and studied that. And coming out of it, there wasn't really any jobs for him, but still that's what his main focus was. But then he started working with Iarina. He met our team right at the same time was the Solar Canoes Against Deforestation project. And now that's changed his trajectory because you have one of the brightest minds in the Amazon, not focusing on extraction anymore, but focusing on alternative energy. And so through this project and also our NSF partners, he's going to be able to come to the US and also have an internship, learn English, and continue. And so that's just like one example of the brightest minds that we have. But this is something that we're going to continue doing, and I'm happy to talk more about later. I think I'm over time. Yeah.
So wonderful to hear everyone share their stories and experiences. And I'd like to start with a question inspired by what Nico was saying. So overall, the framing of our discussion is how do we cultivate hope in facing the extinction crisis? But I loved your framing of awe. And I would love for all of the panelists to engage with the idea of awe. Specifically, what is something that brings you joy or awe or gives you these moments of mindfulness in your practice? And what would your hope be for the next generation in terms of awe and inspiration? And we can start anywhere. Maybe we start with Mike and fan out. So what was your aha moment, Mike, or what brings you joy or awe in this work?
Great question. I was fortunate enough to go to E-Arena at one point as well. And I must say that before I went back to grad school, it wasn't there, but it was also in Oriente, in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And it was a place of quiet, of dark skies, a place where, and that was one of the places that I was at. My motivation for going back to graduate school was just this place that I thought was very special, and yeah, it was very, very important to me. Oh gosh, what do I envision for future generations? Let me think about that. I'll get back.
Well, we can fan out. So maybe Risa, what was your aha moment, or what brings you joy, gives you awe, mindfulness moments?
Yeah, sure. So what I didn't say is that my dissertation, Leah called me out for studying de-extinction, but I study de-extinction in the midst of the stories that people tell about extinction largely. And one of the things that I focus on is making space for the more negative emotions that we like to push away, like especially the grief that we feel in conservation. And I think holding those emotions while also focusing on like all the effort that so many people are putting into trying to make this better, I think, rather than just trying to push those emotions away with saying that we can bring back mammoths and that the world will be fine. I think making space for the grief that like is really genuinely deserves to be felt for the world in the way that it is at this moment in time, and not denying people the chance to feel those emotions while also saying that there are so many people trying, and also just for me personally, like the resilience of nature and being out in nature and seeing how abundant and how it continues on, and that, yeah, I don't know, there's not really a real end in the ruins.
Could you maybe pass the mic to Ellie, and I'd love for you to explain what Yakachina is as you answer. Yakachina, yeah.
Yeah, so my dad is better at explaining this word. He does linguistic work, but I grew up being one, it's in my language, so. Yakichina is this, so first of all, there is no word for love in my language, and there is no word for nature, which is interesting, as it's something that really drives us to protect our land and our community. But there's this other word called Yakichina, and Yakichina kind of involves all of this. And it's a word that means overwhelming love, joy, but also holding that space, I think, for the tragedies of life and how we move forward. So it's feeling all these things, but understanding that we are not just in our bodies, but understanding that we're also a part of the land. And like the land, we can also process these different emotions. So that's what Yakichina is.
Aha moment or your joy moment.
I think of my parents. I think of my mom. You know, where I am, the land is parceled up and divided. And I've seen my entire life just forests diminish, and I've seen the water become contaminated. But one thing that inspires me is that the forest that surround me, immediately around my house, was planted by my parents, and they had hope. And those trees are the same age as I am. And so I feel like there's so much love in that and thinking about the future. But one other aha moment, my mother, I'm 28 now, and my entire life I've seen her kill cockroaches. They do not go away. They are resilient. And so I just think about cockroaches and also the love of my parents.
Beautiful, thank you. Now, Mr. Chua, what was your aha moment, or what brings you joy or gives you hope?
Well, for me, there are two when I think about. One was what has brought me this far into this journey, and it's also inspired by my mom. Going into conservation, she wasn't necessarily ecstatic about it at all, but communicating with her made me realize just what Risa was talking about, that environmental communication is important. I realized that there was a big gap between what I was being taught theoretically at school versus how she was relating it to her world. And I was like, I realized where the gap is coming from. I was not able at that time to make the link to see the practicality of how she's living conservation or environmental protection versus what I was being taught. So then I'm like, okay, so this is a focus, grad school. I need to learn more about how to involve humans in the way I talk about environmental protection, in conservation, in those narratives. So that's the first part. The second one, which relates to the Girls Conserve program, is just looking at how the diversity of students that attended and they being very ecstatic about it. Also, the program in itself was also intentional. It was not just about we are trying to hook these young high schoolers on, but it was also intentional about thinking about the backgrounds of these people into how we are going to structure the program to get them involved. So in a way, it was not like fake. It wasn't like we're just trying to grab you, but it was also thinking about where they are coming from and how can we communicate this to keep them hooked on for the long term. So those were the two times that I'm like, we need to look at this more from a people place where people are coming from, rather than what we just want to give out to them.
That's great. We agree on this. We really care about the curriculum reflecting and affirming the experiences of the students. So it's something I love about Girls Conserve too. And so Nika, I'd love for you to continue your thoughts on awe and share your aha moment or something that brings you joy or passion.
Love all of these answers, and I'm not a conservation scientist, so I'm trying to think of a good answer for myself. But I remember the first time that I remember feeling awe was in the desert. I'm from New York, I'm from Queens. So I remember seeing slivers of the sky. You don't really see the sky. You see the sky between buildings. You sometimes see the moon. If you go out to the suburbs, you might see a wider perspective. But you don't really see the sky in a panoramic way. And so when I came out to the desert, it was shocking to me that the sky went all the way around and that you could actually see it. And it was so beautiful and awe-inspiring because I had never even conceptualized our space in that way. And so that's a moment of awe. And what brings me joy is animals. I think that we can learn so much. I have dogs, I foster dogs, and I'm very into animal advocacy. And so I think that they can teach us a lot about mindfulness, about forgiveness, and about joy.
Thank you. I'd like to start with Risa for the next question. So if you can pass the microphone to Risa. So just thinking about that, we've heard a lot about collaboration, about support, and I'm thinking about hope and love. And I loved what you said about storytelling in the next generation. So when we think about the future of education in all these spaces, I like to say that it's relational, that all of our relationships make stories and all of our stories make worlds. And it matters what relationships make those stories and those worlds. So as you think about education and storytelling, what do you wish we did differently, or what have you learned from your research that we can use to apply to the future of education as relationships, as stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, first of all, what I wish that we did differently is that, again, that STEM spaces made encourage training in storytelling, not just because I think science communication, for one thing, is a field that we don't have training in general, but even science communication, it's so focused on removing jargon and just communicating the science objectively and accessibly, but still very much kind of devoid of emotion. So I think in addition to just being able to communicate our science well in a way that anyone can understand, it's important to make space for being able to tell the stories that do center on relationships, and not just with other people, but with nature and ecosystems and our land and our homes. Yeah, and so I wish that there was, and also for, especially in the fields of environmentalism and conservation, people are coming into this because they care. And so I think making spaces for conservationists to tell their own stories too is a really great way to empower and build relationships between the people in these spaces.
And when we're doing that work, Nika, how can we encourage mindfulness? So how can we find moments of big sky in the city?
I think that the more that we cultivate mindfulness in everyday moments, the more we can see it in the larger moments. So it's not just a matter of noticing the big joys or the larger events, but it's really noticing the smaller things that happen every day that we might miss when we're running on automatic, when we're running on autopilot, when we're so stuck in our habits that we can't see beyond them. When we stop and notice those tiny moments of happiness or contentment or peace, we can see the larger moments in a greater and deeper way.
Nodding his head, do you have some thoughts on this too? How do we cultivate big sky moments in the city?
Just a couple comments. A close friend and collaborator of mine has done a lot of work on convivial conservation. This is the work of Bram Buser, and one of the aspects of that is thinking about nature not as some disconnected thing that's out there. That's a very Western perception of nature. And so when we talked about our awe-inspiring moments, a lot of it was about being out and away, but there's very much this part that's about being present and here and seeing the birds splashing in a small pool of water as you're walking across campus, or seeing small flowers. These kinds of things I think are really important to us.
I say that all the time too, because my dissertation was on coffee plantations in Brazil, and everyone said, well, of course you could study nature, you were in nature. I'm like, when I'm in Phoenix, am I not in nature? What is that? Today I was running late to work and I had to pull over to take a phone call, and I was in a garden with Palo Verdes with yellow flowers, and it felt like the cherry blossoms of Japan or something. It was gorgeous. So we do have these micro moments where we see beauty, but a lot of times we have really dark moments where we see hard things to see, and there's a lot of anxiety. And so I do want us to not just romanticize all of our work and talk about the cutest things and the happiest things. So let's get to the actual question of how do we cultivate hope when we're facing adversity and injustice, and how do we find love and show love in spite of everything that's going on, maybe because of everything that's going on? That's a really tough question, so whoever wants to take it first.
Hello? There you go. Big question. But I feel like I'm an expert at this because I've seen my home being destroyed. And, you know, I'm going to start out by saying my grandmother. She says that as Indigenous women, that our strength comes from the river, and that to gather this strength, you have to go to the river right when the sun is coming up. I don't know if that was just her way to get us to wash ourselves in the morning, but maybe it's that traditional knowledge. But I think it's a little bit of both. It's that love, certainly, that she had and something that was taught to her by women in, that came generations before us. And the thing is that every time that I'm going through some sort of crisis, right, like thinking about just overwhelming thoughts, I go into this river. And I feel it take all those sorrows and those pains away. And maybe each one of you has a space like that. And it doesn't always have to be in nature. It can be a song, too. And I go, but nowadays when I go to this river, I just think about how I have to be careful not to drink it, or I can't stay in it too long because it is contaminated. And there haven't been studies done, at least in that river, like what's going to happen to us over time. So there is this huge worry, and now my cousins and I have to constantly look for cleaner water, and it's getting further and further away, or it's drying up. And so I think in moments like this, I think about community. I think about all of, my own relatives, all of you who are here. I can't possibly imagine what your own life stories are and have been, and everything that you've endured, but I know that we're here together and that we're working on things. And I think just this idea of how in this globalized world and using technology, we're a lot closer than we think. And I think that's what I want to leave off on is we're a lot closer than we think, and we really can do this.
Before I pass it to the audience to ask questions, does anyone else want to answer that one? Yeah, let's just do it. Audience questions now. We have about 8 minutes left. What curiosities do you have for this incredible panel of people? Or just clap now because they're awesome. But seriously, does anyone else want to take the microphone for a second and share their aha moment or ask a question of the panelists? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Abby's doing a great job, yeah?
That was the laziest. Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. We know that fear motivates a lot of people, but it's not sustainable. And so as you're thinking about educating the next generation, what are the positive feedback loops that you're trying to build into their progress of making a difference that will increase their likelihood that this can be a lifelong career, a lifelong stewardship, a lifelong passion, when they probably came in here because it's an epistemic crisis, or it's, do you understand the tension of how do you sort of shift the conversation or the mindset or balance it?
To it, I don't know. So how do I'll reframe it maybe, like I think about climate anxiety, and I see one of the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes we make in science communication is to terrorize folks with the facts because we feel them. And so it's like we don't think that people believe that climate change is real. So the way to solve that is to show them the scariest numbers, because then they'll believe it because they're right there. And I think this alienates the audience, and the hardest part about this is that is real, and it has to be named, and it has to be acknowledged. And by naming and acknowledging it, it makes it harder to engage in a discussion. So I'm gonna try and reframe the question because it's so big and so difficult to say, how do we keep talking even when we're scared? Or why should we keep talking because we're scared?
In not really answering the question, let me just say, many of you have seen the recent book that's come out that's getting tons and tons of press right now, The Anxious Generation. To me, this is just the latest You know, every generation gets this book that says the current generation is the one that's really screwed up. And those are often followed by another book that says our parents or our grandparents are the ones that screwed things up. And so we have this dialogue that goes back and forth, and it's every generation. And I just find this a bit nonsensical. I tend to find great hope and inspiration in the following generations. I think that we continue to see improvements in so many areas. We tend to focus on the problems, the crises, and there's some big ones, like the one we're talking about here today, but we see lots of other things improving. We see crime rates currently going down. We see economic improvement. We see better health outcomes, not just here in the US, but globally. We see lots of reasons for optimism. I try to focus on a lot of those and not stick with the negative stories. This isn't meant to be Pollyannish and think away our problems or that problems don't exist, but we can work on the problems that do exist as well as acknowledging the clear benefits that we're seeing in other places too.
So I'll try to see if I can give you a response from my own experience, although you probably have more life experience than me. But so in my family or upbringing, I am like the first to have gone this far in education, and weirdly enough, venturing into conservation aspect, which is not what they would have been expecting, especially for employment and for financial reasons. So right now, I'm like a beacon to the very younger siblings and cousins as to what I'm doing. But they always come back with a question about the future and how would they be able to sustain themselves. And the way I try to encourage them is to understand or to see the kind of careers that they are looking at. And I do well to pick up on that and infuse or put in environmental moments where they could apply, even though maybe their objective is more of a financial security, that even though you're looking for this financial security, it will not be there if our environment or the nature around us keep deteriorating. I have a younger brother who is studying land economy, and he wants to go into real estate. And I'm like, cool. But when you're going into real estate, I also want you to keep in mind that it's not just about building the houses and the home, but how can we build these homes to make them more environmentally friendly? What are the aesthetics or things that we could infuse? So that is the way I try to inspire them to be hopeful, even though it looks unendingly very chaotic. So I try to pick up on where they are trying to go, and with my own background in conservation and environmental activism, just talk to them about, oh, there are other loopholes or areas here where you could foster that, because they care about the planet, but they're also thinking about how to sustain themselves in future.
Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, so one thought that inspired is that I think when people don't often talk about these topics, their first question is, and what can I do? And I think what Nana Sutra was saying is really helpful. It's you start the conversation with where they are. So you don't just impose your idea on top of them. You don't tell them this is what you've been doing wrong. You get curious, you engage in a compassionate conversation, and you seek to understand before you try to be understood. And I think that's what I learned from your story about your family and real estate is everyone has their own passion, and especially in education and especially with children, our job is to support their dreams and tread lightly and to support them with love and compassion, because we know that all of us are facing impossible circumstances and that we have an endless capacity for love. So I think with that, we'll close for today. And I do want to do a quick plug because Ellie is here and Donovan is here. We do have an event today that's going on at the same time. So at lunch, on the same floor on the opposite side of the building, there are some beautiful framed photos, including one of Ellie's grandmother. and they're student generated and from our partners in Ecuador, and that'll be there all day today. So I encourage you to stop by to see Resilience, a photo exhibition. And I'd like to thank the panelists. This was really fun, and I feel great. Like, I feel hope. So thank you so much for being here today, and enjoy the rest of the day.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone for joining this fascinating discussion. Our last panel will be facilitated by Dr. Chris Barton, and we have a wonderful panel. We will be addressing sort of this broader question, referring back to our strategic pillars. We're doing this amazing work globally to bring biodiversity to the decision making. We're training the next generation, but we're also trying to document and study and learn from what we're doing. And so that will be the focus of the next panel. And with that, I'll pass it over to Chris.
Hello. Welcome, everybody. We've got a wonderful panel here. Myself, Rebecca, Beckett, Paula, David, and Dave. As Leah mentioned, this is where we sort of get a little bit introspective. CBO, we like to not just do the work, but also study ourselves as we're doing it so we can learn to do it better. And very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize this and some of the outcomes that we've had so far. So we often think about this as there being sort of these two arrows that ideally would intersect. On the left-hand side, we have knowledge production, or the supply side of knowledge. And on the right-hand side, we have knowledge use, or the demand side dynamics. And ideally, these link up in the middle. The supply of knowledge links up with demand, and there's action taken on the biodiversity crisis. But that's not always the case. Sometimes these arrows don't meet up in the middle. Sometimes they're just going straight past each other. Sometimes they're going in opposite directions. And so what we were really interested in is first, what do knowledge producers do to produce knowledge which is actionable, which is used? Second, how do knowledge users access that knowledge, and what do they do with it, and how do they understand the relationship with the knowledge producers? And if they are interacting, what makes that effective? What is the most effective way for knowledge and action to interact? And a couple of outcomes that we've had from this so far. We've looked at best practices for creating the sort of actionable science. We found that collaboration, empathy, the ability to build relationships, and communication are all important on an individual level. And incentives and resources are important at an institutional level, which shouldn't surprise anybody there. We looked at how people approach creating actionable science, how knowledge producers approach it, and we identified 5 different approaches which stack on each other. And the ultimate one there, the best practice, if you will, is co-production, which is sort of a comprehensive engagement with the knowledge producers and users in a process that produces both knowledge and action out of the same dynamic. We looked then at how practitioners approach knowledge use, and we found that rather than how knowledge producers often see themselves as primarily producing knowledge, practitioners often don't see a distinction between knowledge production and knowledge use. They see it all happening together, and they see what they do as much about producing knowledge as about using it. And so that's where our work is now. But it's gotten us thinking, what does it mean to do impactful conservation research? And it turns out it's really not what is incentivized in academia. It's not about producing papers. It's not about giving speeches. It's about the long, hard work of building relationships and building trust and working with the people who are actually on the ground, who are in the places that we are trying to make an impact. And so we're going to hear a little bit more about that next. And, going backwards. And now we have Rebecca.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I am a current PhD student and a former conservation practitioner. And I am currently working with Chris, along with Leah and Candace Carr-Kelman on phase 2 of the work that Chris just presented. And I wanted to quickly give a shout out to the 4 undergraduate researchers that we're also working with this semester, Joyce, Lillian, Lauren, and Jasmine. They've been really instrumental to this work. And apologies, I had some last minute changes to the slides that didn't make it in, unfortunately. But really, with this work, we're looking at partnerships between organizations that expressly aim to produce the knowledge and science and tools and data to guide conservation decision making by those involved in the partnership. And so really there's limited documentation of all these different types of partnerships between various sectors, many of which are represented at CBO, but between academia and nonprofit and private sector and government. And really we want to understand how partnerships serve as a space for co-production and identify common strengths and challenges within these partnerships. And in particular, the important factors that contribute to the production of actionable science. And so to do this, we are using the scorecard approach that Chris alluded to, and it consists of a survey as well as a semi-structured interview. And from this assessment, the scorecard, we're able to get an overall partnership score and scores for the different phases of the partnership, as well as different kind of categories of factors. So organizational factors, team factors, goals and objectives. And so we've assessed a large variety of partnerships and are still continuing to do that. And we've even looked at one of CBO's own partnerships so that we ourselves can learn from this process and improve the way we collaborate. And so with this scorecard, we can provide useful insights to those partners that participate in this process. And so far, it's been really fascinating, some of the insights we've gathered. It's kind of the really important factors in terms of actionable science is kind of a curiosity-driven engagement from the outset. One of the areas where we've seen the most opportunity for improvement is kind of in the initiation phase, but I don't necessarily see that as a weakness, because the initiation phase of a partnership is when all of this learning is occurring. And so it makes sense that a partnership would improve over time as there's this continuous kind of iteration on the research that's being produced and this kind of exchange, this bi-directional exchange of knowledge. And I think one challenge we also encountered was differences in organizational cultures and incentives. So in academia, we often prioritize publications and novelty, and that's not always the most useful thing. So we kind of need to learn how to reconcile differences in how we work across different sectors. And I think that process of kind of continuous iteration and feedback and recognizing the value that practitioners bring and their knowledge is really critical to successful partnerships and outcomes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paola Sangolki. I'm from the Galapagos Island, Ecuador, and I'm a PhD candidate working with Leah Gerber. And today I want to present you a little bit of the work that we've been doing in the Galapagos Island through the Landfest Ocean Program. And this is based on what Chris presented also at the beginning. So it's like producing knowledge that will be useful for managers for decision making. So like producing relevant information that will be supporting decision making. So with that goal set for 2030 to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030. We have this very ambitious goal which has been set as an objective. However, most of the new recently marine protected areas that have been created not even have a management plan. So with this goal set for 2030 and with what CBO is working based on structured decision making, we're trying to support the Galapagos National Park Directorate to come through a very structured process where we involve all stakeholders in promoting and producing the knowledge to state clear objectives that will support the sustainable management of this protected area. So the case of the Galapagos, it's quite interesting because it's one of the probably most famous marine reserves in the world. There's a lot of science going on and happening. However, most of the results of this science are sitting on papers in the director's office, and they can't even read it because they're in English. So we are working with them to come up with solutions and see how we scientists support what they need to come up with better results that involve different audiences that may not be able to understand things in the same way that we do. So in that sense, I also want to highlight some of the other aspects that people have discussed, which is awareness, education, participatory processes that are not the same as socialization, which is often confused. And for that, so we are working together with them to better understand this socio-ecosystem in the Galapagos Island and how we can take this participatory process to arrive to consensus-based decisions based on the best available information. Often when we think about science, we think that always involves collecting data. However, I come from a place where there's like 20 years of data of sea turtles population. However, we are not yet in the position to answer how is the population of turtles doing. So we are developing with them some tools, decision support tools to inform their management strategies. So just to give you a very brief example, we developed a tool, Camila, a colleague in the lab, she developed a tool to assess the cost efficiency of certain strategies, but instead of using some fancy softwares that we might use here or elsewhere, we translated all of this in a language and to a platform that they can easily and freely access, like Excel, Microsoft Excel, but it's giving them all the different tools that they need and that they will be able to use. We are also co-developing a management, a decision-making framework in which we connect data to decisions. And the Galapagos has been a successful example of how bottom-up processes can be successful if we take into account every single step of the structured decision-making process. So recently, in the Galapagos, we created a new marine reserve, the Hermandad Marine Reserve, in a record time. And this involved having conversations with the industrial fishing sector, for example. And it was quite interesting because for this process, we apply what we've been working with them, the structured decision-making, which relies heavily on understanding the problem, which is step one, and is often avoided in most of the processes. So I think I'm out of time.
I'm okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was great to hear Ellie talking about exchanging knowledge. In my case, it's weaving knowledge, but we have been exchanging and weaving for 6 years now down in Ecuador, and we'll have the opportunity to continue here in Arizona. So it's a great moment for celebration, which is what Leah was framing this event for. Weaving knowledge systems is tricky, very tricky, because it involves a lot of inner work. At least that's my experience. And this might work differently for different people, but it's, in my case, this inner work that was required took the form of 3 steps. It should be 1, 2, 3, but anyway. I guess it's all cyclical, so it's always come back to. And the first step, or one of the steps, is to recognize that every knowledge system is limited and limiting. We say often that all models are wrong and some are useful, and I would say that all knowledge systems are useful, but they are useful in very different ways and for very different purposes. And, the intellectual realization of that is important, but it's not enough because I was educated, as maybe some of you, in a Western education system in which I was taught to this logic of verticality, and even I embodied a life orientation of verticality in which I'm constantly comparing what is better, what is worse, what is above, what is below, what is superior, and it's something that is so internalized that I didn't realize. No? And for working, in conservation action and weaving these knowledge systems, I needed to unlearn that verticality and embody a better sense of horizontality in all my life. This is like a lifelong work, right? And then after that, then I was able to really recognize that all knowledge systems are equally valid. This is, it seems simple, but it's not that simple. And they are valid within their own onto-epistemology and within their own onto-epistemological assumptions. But they all have something to say about reality that the others cannot tell us, right? So after all this inner work, then I was able to start building relationships across cultures and across species, meaningful type of relationships. So the weaving, this word, I didn't choose the word because I have a hard time pronouncing it, but the weaving of this knowledge system could start at this point. And yet, again, this wasn't enough because academics are very time poor. And we often to be displaced. I have been displaced for a long time and many times out of place, but that's another problem. But the thing is that we need to center, it's not only about horizontality, it's about centering the conservation actions on the people who are in place, the people who haven't been displaced yet. And that's what we have been working. I have been trying to work with Ellie, with Leah, with Mike, Nana, Jana. Well, I'm probably going to miss people, but and many other people through projects in the Ecuadorian Amazon for the last 6 years. And I started with this centering study abroad programs in local people by seeing them as providers of educational and cultural and research services to universities. And at the same time, they can, there is knowledge exchange, right? And they can benefit from the presence of university students there or researchers. And also co-producing solutions, sustainability solutions and green infrastructure that are centered in the needs of the local people and the indigenous people. The solar power canoe that Ellie has talked about, and that, there is an exhibition, photo exhibit that also Jana mentioned about both the study abroad program and the solar power canoe that you can see later. This is the premise in which these co-produced solutions are based. The same with virtual reality experiences. We can provide the technology to the local people, but they are the ones telling the stories and doing the recordings, and then it's a way of centering. And biocultural monitoring of species by not seeing species as objects or something that you can count and that you can set apart, pull apart, but as beings, beings that has a social life. That's how the Quechua ontoepistemology sees trees and animals and all that. So it has been great to work on these activities, and this is, I hope, an invitation to anyone here who is interested in joining the team, because the more, the merrier. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Beckett Sterner, Associate Professor in the School of Life Sciences. My background is as a historian in philosopher biology, but I also started off thinking I was going to be a computational biologist. So some days I put on a scientist hat and some days I put on a philosopher hat, depends on the questions that I want to ask. I want to start by just highlighting one of the coolest things that CBO has done, which is get ASU involved in the Red List of Threatened Species and the Red List of Threatened Ecosystems. This is really some of the largest cooperative, global, international efforts to keep track of what's happening to nature, of almost entirely volunteer effort by thousands of scientists. Really amazing that it works and that it keeps going. And it has this incredible mission of trying, for the Red List of Threatened Species, to track basically every macro scale eukaryotic species, plants, animals, fungi, other sorts of things you can at least see with your eyeballs. I want to highlight the work of my colleague, Beth Polidoro, who's the lead for the partnerships and with me as a co-lead. ASU has contributed assessments of thousands of important species, marine, coral species. The Sonoran desert plants had never been assessed and monitored before. And so getting those on the table is really crucial to understanding then what happens over the next 5, 10, many decade timescales. And it really is an awesome opportunity to bring students in. It's very easy to get certified and trained online, and then provides workshops where people do the assessments collaboratively. In my own thinking, I've come to appreciate the Red List as really a radical act of care and attention, but in a kind of funny way, because oftentimes the caring for the species happens in a room very far away from where the species are, and it amounts to writing down in a highly standardized and rigorous way what is known about those species. And yet, if you don't pay attention to them, you cannot care for them effectively out in the world, or at least if you do, it's often by happenstance. And so, coming back to this question of knowledge production and where do we take it so that the supply and the demand are really aligned, the Red List is really well established and successful, but also really focused on pushing out information, and then hopefully it gets used for prioritization or policymaking downstream. But how would we take those sorts of knowledge infrastructures that are being created now and which have reached a level of maturity and ask how could they support co-production better? How could they better center indigenous peoples and local communities? And that's where I think some of my recent work has been trying to understand what are the models out there, and how can we start to try and relate them to each other, or understand their strengths, assumptions, sort of heuristic limitations. A lot of the most prestigious global databases you'll see are on sort of the left side of the figure, and they're kind of like going to a Pret to pick up your lunch. They've already decided how your food will be chopped and combined and boxed, and you can choose to download it in one form or another. But it's very much an off-the-shelf product. And then as you start to go from left to right in the figure, we're looking at decreasing standardization and pre-processing. You're starting to get closer to what was contributed or to what's being provided by local communities. Like if you go to Chipotle, right, you can choose to mix your ingredients. It's kind of like searching across 10 different databases using an index portal, but you definitely only get to choose between these two kinds of beans. All the way down to make your own, right, which can be the most fun, but you don't want to do it every day for 1,000 people. And so an interesting trade-off of like, well, when would you want to have a pure data commons? When is that a sustainable solution or a 5-year solution versus setting up another global data aggregator? And part of what I think about here as a philosopher is how there's more than the interactions and interpersonal relationships at work here. These knowledge infrastructures are a whole class of organization, now that people are trying to regulate and inform. And often scientists have these very strong, pervasive ideals in the back of their head about where is this all going? How is this supposed to be working better? What I'm calling a regulative ideal. And crucial issues here are whether you think that ultimately the best answer is to have all the data in one place, which sounds nice, but then you have to standardize it so it all works together. And that can be a really big problem, especially if you have many sources, right, that you have to then harmonize somehow. Versus having lots of different places to go, but then they're really closely connected to the communities that actually care about the data and maintain it. And so I want to highlight here how there are alternative models, some of which are more pluralistic, like on the right, but keep everyone connected. And those often get lost as people think, oh, well, what we need here is the next database, right? We need to put all the data together. But is that really going to deliver the most value? Thinking critically about how those ideals make substantive assumptions and then can have key failings depending on what you're trying to do, I think is a really important place to push the supply and demand side picture forward.
Chris, could I have you go back to the first slide? Thanks. I'm Dave Gustin. I'm an associate vice provost here in the Global Futures Lab. I'm a political scientist by training. And very early in my career, 3 decades ago, a little bit more, I started writing about boundary organizations. I'm not going to give you a catechism about boundary organizations, but I am going to give you another catechism a little bit later. But I'm very sensitive to, particularly after Beckett's presentation, that lunch is looming. So yesterday in this room at a town hall that Knowledge Enterprise, KE, was hosting, President Crow stalked the floor for about an hour and gave something like his canned speech about the history of the institutions of science in the United States and a history of science policy. To somebody like me trained in science policy, you know, like in a way President Crow, this was, you know, a regurgitation of things that I had studied, but for a standard university audience, particularly people trained in STEM fields, it might have been something that was eye-opening. The story that he told, particularly the more modern story that starts in 1945 with the writing of Vannevar Bush's essay, long essay, you know, sort of novella-length policy analysis called Science, the Endless Frontier, is essentially a story about the institutions on the left-hand side of that chart. And what you all have done here is work on a different model, okay? And I want to emphasize this in, you know, acknowledgement of the difficulty of working on a different model of simply saying, okay, we'll create some knowledge and it'll go down this line and it'll go from discovery to use in some way that we haven't conceived of, and say, okay, look at the work that you have done. It really is tremendous, and it's tremendously difficult in creating that understanding, in creating the collaborations that underlie that understanding, and in pushing against a decades-old model of how things are supposed to be, because that's how our institutions were set up. Those are the arrangements that satisfied the people who were in those institutions because it allowed them to do whatever the hell they wanted, and it was also part of a set of relationships that they had with the funders and so on and so forth. And I know I'm seeing Leah nodding vigorously. You know, I'm sure, for example, that Leah has had difficulties on the funding side of this because it hasn't fit into the standard paradigm of what was supposed to be happening in conservation science. So I want to really acknowledge that and congratulate you for spending 10 years swimming upstream against that left-hand side of the model. Second thing I want to do is really invite you and emphasize the need for this kind of work in GFL to spread across what we have in GFL. And this is, you know, going back to Dave's earlier comments and conversations that Dave and I have had since, you know, DCDC was founded 2 decades ago, since CBO was founded a decade ago. I'm I think a lot has been lost in the conversations around knowledge for impact and knowledge in action since a time around that time, that these questions were much more apparent, were much more in discussion, were much more current in the way that the predecessors to GFL did their business. And I really want to take the opportunity to invite, for the future CBO, to be part of a more robust conversation that GFL needs to have about that diagram. And to conclude, and I know I'm now down to 2 seconds, here is the catechism that I'm going to give you, which is derived from something that you might have heard of, what was called the Heilmeyer Catechism, which was a set of questions that were formulated by a program officer at DARPA in the 1960s. I think his first name was Robert, but I'm not absolutely sure, Heilmeyer. And basically, he was trying to get principal investigators to focus on the essential elements of what their proposals were. And so I'm sort of floating a draft impacts catechism. And to the extent that it sounds familiar with everything that you've heard here, may mean that I'm on the right track and that you're all on the right track. If there are things that don't sound familiar, that seem at cross purposes, please tell me, because this is in draft, but I want it to be real. Number one, what specific audiences are you addressing or constructing? Number two, what causal model do you have in mind for creating impact? Number three, how are you creating opportunities to have that impact? Number four, who or what connects your outputs to impacts and outcomes? How are you participating in researching, keeping track of intermediate impacts along the way? And perhaps a statement of the beauty of what you've done here. How will you humbly and accurately tell the story of the impact that you have? Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. We do have a Q&A session, and I want to bring it out to the audience, but I want to open the floor to anybody who has a response to Dave's catechism. Anybody on the panel? Anybody in the audience? Okay, you can tell him later, I guess. So the discussion that we were going to bring up is what are the best practices for bridging knowledge, action, and conservation? But inspired by the last panel, I want to amend this a little bit and make it a little bit less consultant-y and a little less plastic. Because best practices are the best of the things that have already been done. And I find that it's really important to, when looking for places to find hope in this sort of work and to find, the ability to believe that it is possible to accomplish what we're setting out to do, it's good to look for models and inspiration rather than looking at what is the best of what we've already done, what is the best of what we could do instead. And so the question that I'd like to pose to the panel is, how can we do this differently? What models inspire you that we here in this room and at CBO and at ASU could draw from to inform our work and how we bring knowledge to action? And I know Dave has thought about this for a long time, so if nobody else is going to go, I'm going to call at him.
Well, maybe a word that I don't think I have heard yet, but it's extractive mentality. When I started working on conservation, I made this duality and distinction between, we have these industries that are extractive and then conservation is against that. But then I realized that the mentality of extraction is so embedded in our society, in our academic system, that many times, even though you're not extracting maybe material products, but you're extracting data or you're extracting the time of the people, and we don't, because also, we have this materialistic bias, we overlook these other forms of extraction. So for me, the models that really are best practices, one requirement is that they need to be aware of this tendency to be extractive and have ways in which people do something with that awareness and start doing things differently. Now, why is so easy to fall into destructive mentality? Because, of course, you know, it's benefiting, it's, you know, it's, there is a sense of closure, of appropriation and all that. So it's complicated, right? But I think we need, that word for me is useful to establish, you know, one very high level criterion to define best practices.
Sure, I can jump in. So I think one thing I was thinking about is, you know, we've talked a lot about the supply and demand for knowledge, and you know, as I mentioned before, asking questions about, you know, what is it that you need, like understanding the needs of conservation practitioners is essential, but I think you could deliver a tool or knowledge that was identified as needed and that can still go unused. And there are a few different things that I've encountered that kind of affect that. So one of the things that's come up, one of the themes that has come up in some of the discussions I've had in the knowledge partnerships is you know, lack of transparency. You know, what are the pieces that are going into this tool or data, and people are less likely to use those things that they don't understand. And in my prior work, I did a literature review on early warning systems. And one of the things that continuously came up was that people were more likely to use early warning systems if they themselves had contributed some piece of data to that system. So, for example, farmers would do some of the data collection themselves and felt like then they had some insight into how this tool operated. And that's one of the things that I think is really essential, is making sure that we're not just responding to the demands, but really bringing practitioners into the process, into the kind of production process beyond just kind of asking questions. So yeah, that's one thing I would add.
So some of you may know the paper that was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. First author, David Cash, came out of Bill Clark's work at Harvard on environmental assessments. I was a very minor co-author on that paper, but it dealt with qualities of knowledge that helped build actionable sustainability science: credibility, legitimacy, saliency. Those are qualities of knowledge, and as whatever qualities that paper had, it was still mostly about being on the left-hand side of that diagram. And one of the places that some scholarship has gone since then is thinking about that incredibly difficult three-word phrase there, knowledge to action. We don't have very much language about doing that. But when my colleagues here at ASU, who have done work on futures and scenario development and so on, have explored that work, because every time we ask someone to act on our knowledge, we have something in mind about a future state. Okay? And so this is an encouragement perhaps to you, is to perhaps think more about explicit futures and futuring techniques. But there's a term of art in the futuring community, plausibility. And it is different from probability, and it is different from prediction. And plausibility, the history of that word, is actually that which makes us acknowledge and applaud. It is one word, one concept that we actually have that takes knowledge to action through appreciation. And it's incredibly important for understanding how it is that that imagination of the future, informed by knowledge, turns into action.
I can just add one other component of the supply and demand side that I think is really tricky here is that it's not really a market in a sense of there is no commodity with transparent pricing. The idea that you're going to force it into dollars as more than a very partial, rough understanding of value is deeply flawed, especially when we're talking about things that depend on public infrastructures like scientific knowledge or any other kind of data, open source software, Wikipedia. Those sorts of things are highly incentivized, but often, and often specifically not in monetary terms. But we don't have, again, good models or concepts for how to express and represent the value created or the desire for a certain kind of product outside of that market setup. And so I think, you know, in the context of databases in science, right, part of the push to citations for data is just to provide the most obvious, tangible way of recognizing that someone used your data in a significant way. But all kinds of other things along the lines of metrics of access, use, feedback, edits, you know, where it came from, who created it, all of those sorts of underlying social relationships that are constituted by the technology are not prioritized right now as an important part of the knowledge to action framework. They're not really being invested in to express the way that those networks are actually happening. And so I think that would be a really important component to bring forward so that we can better understand, you know, what is both the social and the technical side of the knowledge in order to get at the supply and demand questions.
And well, I will also like to add, like from the demand side, often I agree with you, it's totally important to understand what are the needs of managers, practitioners, what type of science we could use to support their decision. But we also have to understand what's behind those needs, which usually shows up some conflicts, like from many years with other stakeholders. So I think in the model, we also have to incorporate it local ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, and bring them also to the discussion room, you know, and in make valid those questions, those needs that they also have, and how we can combine technical data, scientific data, but also traditional and local data into the decision-making process. So I think that's also key, and that relates to the previous panel, like let's go back to our roots and understand that we humans are part of nature. And that's the most difficult thing, because it's actually, that's where we need to focus in, like working with humans. And that's where I think we're missing a very important thing. We are probably the crazy part of nature, but still nature. And that's where we need to like really focus all of our efforts. So bringing interdisciplinary perspectives, social, economic, but let's not also leave behind the biological dimension, because that's where we need to raise awareness, like biodiversity. How do we benefit from biodiversity? Like what's gonna a whale or a turtle bring to me? And that's where I think we need to really focus, like, let's remember that we are part of nature as well. And for example, where I come from, animal behavior, it's probably one of the most important ecosystem service, and it's probably not listed anywhere as an ecosystem service, but we rely and depend on animal behavior for our economies. So the fact that you can walk right next to a sea lion, turtle, whale, whatever animal you can think of, and they won't move because they know they're safe, it's actually like a way to raise awareness that we do benefit from biodiversity. So incorporating that into the decision process, I think it's also key.
Thanks. We have like about 7 minutes left. So if there's any questions from the audience, now would be the time.
Thanks. I love this panel because I feel like it's tying everything together. But when you were talking, David, I wrote it down because you said one of the things that you have learned in your work is that we really have to figure out how to cultivate a sense of place in Western society. And I feel like that's what everybody's talking about, right? Like knowledge to action. I really think that action doesn't happen unless people care about it. Like knowledge isn't the driver, it's the caring about it that's the driver. And then this kind of ties back to the previous panel because I feel like, is education the only way to get there? What are other ways? Like, how can we jumpstart this process? Because like we can't wait for the next generation. We've got to do it now. But like, how do we build that? Easy question, right?
Well, everyone, right? Yeah, well, good question. That's one I'm trying to figure out here. But I think, I mean, when you see knowledge to action, this is the intellect and the body, maybe, and this is a very Western model, and this is the model that education is framing to, right? So within education, we need to change that. Probably there are emotions, there is a spirituality, right, that need to be brought into the equation because people are motivated by that. I mean, it's not just that you know something and you act, right? There are lots of other things going on. So infusing that in the education system, I think is important, and not only in the education system, because as you say, it's not, yeah, you know, we're gonna put all our eggs in that basket.
And thinking about what we can do as faculty, students, and staff at ASU, one of the great examples of an effective boundary organization is extension. Okay, set up in the middle of the 19th century in agricultural and mechanical schools. ASU, of course, can't do extension because of our friends down the road in Tucson, but we can do things like it. And GFL has the Walton Sustainability Solutions Service, but that's more built on a consulting model than on a true extension model. But one of the things that we could do here is take these examples of important episodes of co-production, here, knowledge exchange for resilience, sustainable cities network, things that folks downtown in the Watts College are doing, and stitch them together into a bigger, more effective institutional structure for extension. One can even think of it in the model of the Walton Center for Planetary Health in a clinical mode. And that's something that we can think about building at ASU at the next level of all these little centers. Not, not, I don't mean little in, to demean, but all these focal points and bring them together into something more robust across the university.
Yes, I do think education is key, but we also have to be careful about the way we envision education because there's a huge proportion of the world population that doesn't even know how to read. So I would go beyond education, because formal education at least, because the audience that we want to reach is the people that are beyond these doors. And this is not a complaint, FYI. But most of the time, all these conferences, Congress, workshops, I think of them like echo chambers somehow. But the audience that we want to get for bridging the gap between knowledge and action, it's actually not necessarily in these rooms, but out there. So I do think that in that sense, we have to combine, again, traditional knowledge, formal education, and communication is key. Like the way we communicate, like most of our scientific publications, for instance, are in English, and what's the number of people in the world that actually speaks or reads English? And so most of the decisions are based in non-scientific documents or gray literature, and I think that's where I want to also acknowledge the work that CBDO is, the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes is doing, because that's where we want to get. Like, bring all this scientific knowledge in a way, in a format that it's useful for decision makers, but it also includes other information and outputs that can be used by the communities, by local people, by people that are not necessarily involved in the science or conservation world, but will understand the importance and the need of conserving biodiversity.
I think one thing I would add there is that I also really resonated for me how David described many academics as displaced, right? And that is true also for what many universities do to students, is that to get a college education most of the time, or a lot of the time, you have to go somewhere else, even if that's fairly close to home, it's, can take you into a different state or a different country. So I think across the board, the institutions that we're trying to rely on are not clearly oriented towards prioritizing investing in place in a non-extractive way. And in the context of data, I think of the care principles for indigenous data, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics as a very clear and inspiring counter to the FAIR data principles, which are really about how you can describe your data objects better so that computers can more effectively extract value for them, just to boil it down really fast. And what's so amazing about the care principles is that they're grounded in legal bases of UN declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples, tribal sovereignty, et cetera, that give them that power, but then they also have a moral clarity of vision, and more statements of that coming from outside of the university, but with the support of academics to develop them and implement them into change, I think would give us a better grip on whether our higher education institutions can really do what we want them to do there in terms of investing in place. So I think more development of those clear statements of here's what we want to see happen for this institution, and then the follow through on the part of the academics or the other experts involved to think about what are the standards, what are the implementations, what are the evaluative criteria that would need to happen would be a big step forward.
Well, thank you, everyone. We have a very exciting thing up next. We have lunch. So join me in thanking these guys, and I'll pass over to Leah.
Wow. Can y'all hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah? Okay. What an amazing set of panels and presentations today. I'm very, very inspired and delighted by the energy and enthusiasm and ideas that have been generated today. So a couple of just closing thoughts before, I know I'm keeping you from lunch, so we'll keep this short. The first thing that I wanted to express is gratitude for the panelists for really bringing the depth of ideas and thought and authenticity to this discussion. I'm very grateful. I'm also grateful to Abby and the entire CBO team for orchestrating this, especially Abby is relatively new to the role, and her first week, we have an NSF proposal due, and then a couple months later, can you organize this small event? So very grateful to Abby and the entire CBO team, the many volunteers who are here. So that is one thing. I wanted to make a few comments on the themes. So we started off with this idea of these three strategic pillars, and where I think we've landed is this sort of broader integration of these areas in, really I'm seeing these connections between the theme of hope and, this maybe false dichotomy of knowledge and action and decision making. So they seem to all weave together. And I want to, rather than, I think we've shared a lot of ideas, we did try to make this relatively short, and we have these boards around with these questions, And I do want to invite folks to take a few minutes to write down your ideas, stick them on, or share them at the moment. I thought I'd take a few minutes to revisit this, because what we're doing with, you've met many of our program leads. I should mention also who are the program leads. And the program leads are rising stars in the field of sustainability and biodiversity who are leading these efforts. And what we're going to be doing this afternoon is digesting the conversation from today and planning the next decade. So we really, really want your input, because one of, I think, the bread and butter and the heart of CBO is that we work in an inclusive way. So we really want this to be a jointly defined effort. So let's come to that. Not to mention, I don't want to forget to mention that we have this photo exhibit that will be taking place. Let me give you some logistics. Right upstairs, we'll have a lunch. It's a second floor balcony. So there's a different lunch happening in the courtyard. That's not our lunch. We're going upstairs. There's a small balcony, and there'll be a lunch. And that is a great place from which to explore the photo exhibit, which features some of the work from Ellie and her community in Ecuador. So we're lucky to have that intersect with our efforts today. And before I wrap up, I did want to just open it up for folks to share their general impressions, your general impressions on what resonated, what really stuck with you today, what got you. And if you were driving this ship, where would you go? What should we be focusing on in the future? I have some ideas, but I would love to hear yours. And I know I'm keeping you from lunch, so we won't take too long. I just would like to open it up. If you're more comfortable writing it on the sticky notes, please do. But any comments? Where should we go next? What were you most excited about? Jenna.
Okay, so the connection I made across the panels came from one of the last questions about, is education the only way? And I think I can't leave today without saying that education's always happening everywhere that we are. It's not just formal, it's not just in schools. That's why I see it as relational. It's in all of our relationships. And so tying it back to the KE Town Hall and democracy and everything that's going on in the world, like, this is happening in all of the breaths that we're taking with every beat of our heart. And so it's an interesting realization that it's our work and it's also our life. And so to remember that you're always in relationships, and those are always educational. We're always learning together. And so that means that every opportunity we have when we're interacting with anyone or anything or any being is an opportunity to do something different.
Thank you for sharing that.
So just a reflection on the comment that was made in the last panel about the inaccessibility of some of the knowledge that's generated. Much of it is in English language. It's not in the right place. Just wanted to say a reflection and promotion for that university that's like number 2 or 3 in innovation, like Stanford. I know they're great in other things, but anyway, one of the wonderful women, youth leaders in the climate space, a woman named Sophia Chiani that's out of Stanford, has launched something called Climate Cardinal. And if you're not familiar with that, they do translation, language translation of science to hundreds of different languages around the world. And their organization just received their first large investment from Google to start to leverage AI and other analytics to do language translation for science. So I just think one possible next is, what can you do that's like making knowledge more accessible, making it more inclusive, but then also leveraging new technologies to do that. And I think the work that Sophia Chiani is doing is kind of an example of that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. Any additional thoughts, or is everyone ready to eat? Oh, Paula, making Abby get her workout here.
Thank you, Abby. I just wanted to say thank you, Leah, for creating this space. I think that what I'm taking out of here today, it's hope, because like getting to understand and learn a little bit more of what we're all doing from different perspectives, from different fields like economy, mental health, all the different panelists. It's really powerful. It's really empowering, and I think that's like when I was sitting there at the panel and watching everyone else in the audience like saying yes or yes, like, you know, it's like I think that brings hope for everyone here, because I think we're all working towards a same objective, which is conservation, protection. So I just wanted to thank you again for bringing this space for all of us.
Thank you, Paula. All right. So last words, I just wanted to, that's a perfect segue to just reflect for a few minutes on the journey. 10 years ago, it was around the time that I became a full professor. I had just done the Aldo Leopold Leadership Training Program and had gone on sabbatical, and I came back and I thought, well, what's next? Like, you know, maybe a normal person would say I could relax, but no. And it's exactly what we've been talking about throughout today. I had built my career, I'd come into it from this point of view, I want to have an impact, but then I got sucked into the academic model. I have to do grants, I have to publish. And I'd had a moment to just reflect, what has been the impact of these hundreds of papers and these grants? And it is because of the environment, number one in innovation, that I'm in, that I was able to establish this boundary organization and the reason why we're here today. So I feel deeply grateful for the chance to come up with this idea. It wasn't just my idea. It was shared with many of you and many folks who aren't here today, but then to pitch it and to receive support, to try it out. We are in a university where we can try things out. That's why we're number one in innovation. And because of that small investment and that small bit of hope that was entrusted in me, we're here today. And I'm looking forward with great enthusiasm and joy to the next decade. So thank you so much for joining the celebration. And please join me in enjoying lunch and the beautiful photo exhibit.